Name of the story: The Reflection That Wasn't Me. This story will help you fall asleep, so before we get started, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and comment at what time you are watching. Now relax and enjoy the story. Mara jolted awake, her heart racing, a cold sweat clinging to her skin. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. She lay still for a moment, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling that something was wrong. It was just a nightmare, she reasoned, but as the fog of sleep began to clear, something felt off. The room was the same as it always was: her bed, her nightstand, the old bookshelves cluttered with novels, the paintings hanging crookedly on the walls, all familiar, all ordinary. Yet, her sense of normalcy felt distant, like a reflection in a fogged-up mirror. Her mind raced to process the unease that twisted in her gut, as though something had shifted just out of sight, something she couldn't quite place. She turned over in bed, reaching for her phone on the nightstand. The digital clock blinked 7:32 a.m., its red glow harsh against the calm of the morning. She sighed, pushing herself up, rubbing her eyes and reaching for the light. The hum of the lamp seemed too loud, too intrusive in the otherwise quiet room. With slow, deliberate movements, she stood, stretching her stiff limbs. As her feet touched the cold wooden floor, the sensation sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She always hated that feeling, the way the cold seemed to seep into her bones. Yet this time it was worse. It felt wrong, too sharp, like something beneath the surface of the room had stirred. Mara walked across the room toward the full-length mirror by the closet, planning to run a brush through her tangled hair before starting her day. The reflection that greeted her, however, was not her own. She froze, blinking several times to make sure her eyes weren't deceiving her. The woman staring back at her in the mirror was, well, she was familiar, but wrong. Mara's hand instinctively reached for her face, as though to make sure her features were still in place, to confirm that she had not somehow been changed in the night. Her fingers brushed her skin, smooth and unblemished, the same as it had always been. But the reflection, it moved differently. The woman in the mirror smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite match Mara's expression. The woman in the glass didn't have the same wide-eyed confusion, the same anxiety that Mara felt crawling up her spine. Mara's heart thudded harder, the breath in her chest tightening. "No," she whispered under her breath, taking a slow step back, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The woman in the reflection mimicked her movements, but there was something about her that felt alien. She wasn't exactly wrong, but something about her wasn't right. Her eyes, those eyes were the most unsettling part. They were too calm, too composed. There was no confusion, no panic like Mara's. Just a cold, detached expression. And the smile, it lingered too long, stretching just slightly wider than what felt natural. Mara blinked again, hoping the image would change. But it didn't. The reflection stayed, locked in place, its gaze fixed on hers. The air in the room felt heavier now, like it was pressing in on her from all sides. Swallowing hard, Mara stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath her feet. She reached a trembling hand out to touch the surface of the mirror. Her fingers met the cool glass, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't like the smooth surface she was used to. It was almost sticky, as though something was coating the inside of the mirror, something that shouldn't be there. She recoiled quickly, her mind spinning. What was happening? This wasn't possible. She had to be dreaming. She had to be. This couldn't be real. "Just breathe," she muttered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just a trick of the light. It's fine." But no matter how hard she tried, the discomfort in her chest wouldn't go away. She was acutely aware of every detail around her. The faint smell of lavender in the air from the diffuser on the nightstand, the dull hum of the air conditioning in the corner, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. All these familiar sounds and smells only heightened the strange unease that crawled beneath her skin. Mara turned away from the mirror, a shiver running down her spine. She needed to get a grip. She needed to think clearly. But as she walked toward the bathroom, her reflection in the bedroom mirror remained there, unchanged, as though it was watching her every step. She reached the bathroom, her hands still shaking as she turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on her face. The coolness helped, but only a little. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, this time her own reflection. This one was hers. She could see it, feel it. She could see the weariness in her eyes, the bags under them, the faint lines on her forehead that had come with age and stress. She could see herself clearly here, but when she looked to the side, into the small mirror near the bathroom door, that same woman from the bedroom mirror appeared once again. Mara's stomach churned. How was this possible? Her reflection smiled at her, as if amused by her confusion. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was sharp, like it knew something Mara didn't. Something terrible. "Stop," Mara whispered, taking a step back. The smile in the mirror didn't fade, nor did the eyes lose their coldness. The reflection seemed to be waiting, expectantly, as if it was waiting for her to figure something out. Suddenly, the door to the bathroom creaked open behind her. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She whipped around, half expecting to see someone there. But there was nothing. The bathroom was empty. Her mind spun. Was it all in her head? Was she losing her grip on reality? Mara tried to calm her breathing, but the world around her felt warped, distorted, as though she was trapped in a dream that refused to end. Then, from somewhere deep within the recesses of her mind, a thought emerged. It was a whisper barely audible. "You can't escape her." The words sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. She wasn't sure if she'd spoken them aloud, or if they had come from the reflection. It didn't matter. The idea that she couldn't escape, that she might be trapped in this alternate version of her life, was unbearable. With trembling hands, Mara turned and fled the bathroom, back to the bedroom, where the unsettling image of the reflection was waiting for her. The woman stood there, her smile growing wider, almost mocking. It was as if she had been expecting Mara to return. She tilted her head to the side, eyes narrowing in a look that was both knowing and predatory. Mara stumbled back, panic flooding her chest. The woman in the mirror wasn't her. It was something else, something that wanted her, trapped in a twisted, nightmarish reflection of her own reality. She backed away, eyes darting around the room, seeking a way out. The door, the window, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. "You're mine now," the reflection whispered, the voice chilling and hollow. The words rang in Mara's ears as the world seemed to tilt. Her reflection had spoken, and the real world felt more and more distant with every passing second. Mara's breath grew erratic. She couldn't trust the reflections anymore. She couldn't trust anything. Mara's heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder than the silence that filled the room. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the walls for balance. She looked back at the mirror. The reflection still stood, its eyes following her every move, the smile stretched unnaturally wide, and its presence felt suffocating. A cold gust of air swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. It carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, like wet earth mixed with something metallic. She couldn't quite place it, but it sent a shiver crawling up her spine. "What's happening?" Mara gasped, speaking aloud for the first time since the reflection had begun to move on its own. The woman in the mirror tilted its head slightly, its smile still plastered across its face, and for a fleeting moment, Mara thought she saw something dark, swirling behind those pale eyes, something ancient, something that should not be seen. It was as though the reflection was breathing. Its chest rose and fell with each breath, and for the briefest of moments, Mara felt a flicker of recognition. But it was impossible, wasn't it? Her reflection shouldn't move without her command. It shouldn't breathe. "Stop," Mara whispered, backing toward the door, her hands shaking as she grabbed the handle. Her pulse pounded in her throat, as though it were fighting to escape her body. She needed to leave this room. She needed to get out, get away from the mirror. From her. But as she turned the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. It hadn't been locked before. Her chest tightened, panic bubbling to the surface, and her breath came in shallow, frantic bursts. "No, no, no," she muttered under her breath, her mind spinning. She couldn't stay in here. She couldn't stay with that thing, whatever it was. "Please." She yanked the handle again, harder this time, her fingers slipping from the cold metal. Then she heard it, the softest of whispers, almost inaudible, coming from behind her. Mara, her name, her own name, but it wasn't her voice. It wasn't even close. It was deep, guttural, warped with something wrong. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around so fast that dizziness overtook her for a moment. Her reflection was still there, unmoving. The smile had faded, replaced with something almost serene, as though the figure in the mirror was waiting for her to realize something. And then she heard it again. "Mara," the voice was closer now. Not from the mirror, but from somewhere behind her, somewhere within the room. The air thickened as if something was growing, coiling around her like a slow-moving serpent. "Who's there?" Mara demanded, her voice cracking. She stepped back, her legs trembling beneath her as she scanned the empty corners of the room. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer, just the whispering, filling the silence, growing louder as it closed in on her. It was coming from everywhere, swirling around her like a storm. The mirror seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, its surface rippling with an otherworldly energy. Then, in a split second, the reflection moved. It wasn't a subtle shift, like it had done before. No, this time, the figure in the mirror lunged forward, its hands slamming against the glass. It was as though it was trying to break free, to reach out to her. Mara staggered backward, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in, and the very air felt thick, as though it were filled with something poisonous. The reflection in the mirror, no, the creature in the mirror, was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, it was aware, and it was calling her. In desperation, Mara turned toward the window. Maybe if she could just break the glass, just escape somehow, it would end. She rushed to it, her hands shaking violently as she yanked the curtain aside. The outside world, once so familiar and comforting, now felt distant, unreachable. But before she could even attempt to open the window, a figure moved behind her in the reflection. No, not a figure. Her. The Mara in the reflection, that Mara, was no longer smiling. Her face was contorted into something that resembled a grotesque, twisted mask of confusion and fear. Her eyes, wide and frantic, were fixed on Mara, but the terror in them wasn't her own. It was something else. A deep, bone-chilling realization washed over Mara as she stared into the reflection's eyes. That woman was her, but not her. That wasn't who she was. Not anymore. "Get away from me!" Mara screamed, spinning around and slamming her fist against the glass. But the mirror didn't shatter. It felt solid, and then, without warning, the reflection stepped out. Mara's scream caught in her throat as the reflection, the creature, began to crawl through the glass as if it were liquid, twisting and warping as it emerged inch by inch. Its skin, pale and smooth, stretched and shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes locked onto Mara with a gaze that pierced through her, like it could see everything she feared. It stepped fully into the room, towering over Mara, and for the first time, she saw it completely. The creature was her, and yet it was so much more. It was wearing her face, but its body was wrong. It was elongated, twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its fingers were sharp, unnervingly so, and the smile, oh, the smile was now stretched wide across its face, too wide, too hungry. Mara stumbled backward, her hands pressed against her chest as though she could hold her beating heart in place. Her breath was ragged, her vision swimming with the terror threatening to overwhelm her. "What do you want?" Mara gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The creature in front of her, her reflection, tilted its head, studying her. Its smile never faltered, and then, as though savoring the moment, it spoke, its voice deep, resonating in a way that felt unnatural. "You," it purred. "You are the key. You are the reason I exist." The words slithered into Mara's mind like a poison. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you're not real. You're just a reflection. You're not real." But the creature didn't listen. It stepped closer, its cold presence suffocating Mara's very being. "You think you can escape," it whispered, voice lowering to a rasp. "But you can't. Not now. You're already mine." Mara's breath hitched, and for the first time, the full weight of the situation crushed down on her. She had been living in this world, surrounded by mirrors, by reflections, but this was no ordinary reflection. This was something ancient, something dark, something that had been waiting for her, trapped in the glass for who knew how long. And now it was free. Mara had no idea what it wanted, but she knew one thing. She had to get away. She had to escape, or she would be lost to it. She ran. Mara's heart thudded in her chest as she bolted toward the door. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her body moving on instinct alone. She couldn't hear anything over the deafening sound of her pulse pounding in her ears, but she knew it was following her. She could feel it. It was always there, lurking just behind her, its breath cold against the back of her neck. The door slammed open under her frantic push, and she nearly fell into the hallway. Her hands pressed against the wall for balance as she gasped for air, her lungs burning, her mind spinning. She didn't know where to go. She just had to keep moving. She had to keep running. The house was silent now, eerily so. It was as though everything had fallen still, waiting for the inevitable. Every room seemed to stretch and warp around her, the walls narrowing as she ran down the narrow hallway, past the staircase, and toward the back door. It was her only hope now. She couldn't escape through the windows. They had trapped her before. The door would have to be the way out. But just as she reached the back door, a coldness washed over her, freezing her in place. It was a presence, something alive, radiating an overwhelming force. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Behind her, the reflection had followed her. It had been following her, every step of the way. She could hear it now, the faintest whisper of footsteps, not her own, but its growing louder as it neared. Mara turned slowly, fear constricting around her chest. She looked down the hallway and saw it, it coming toward her, moving with a slow, unnerving pace. The creature wore her face, but there was nothing of Mara left in those eyes. Those cold, empty eyes. It was not her. It couldn't be. The reflection smiled, that same twisted smile, and Mara could see it, see the hunger behind it, the dark, infinite hunger. It wasn't just her reflection. It was a thing that wanted to replace her, to consume her, to take her life and make it its own. "No!" Mara gasped, backing away, her fingers fumbling at the door handle. "No, no, no!" It was too late. The reflection had already closed the distance between them, standing just a few feet away. It was too close. Too close. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice softer now, almost intimate. "You can't hide from me. You're mine, Mara. Always have been." Her mind spun, racing for an escape, but there was nothing left. The house had become a maze, a place without exits. It was a prison, a trap, and it was closing in. The reflection lifted its hand, its fingers long and unnaturally slender. It reached toward her, slow but inevitable. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she felt an invisible force pushing against her, pulling her toward it. Her body refused to move. She couldn't run anymore. The weight of the air around her, the force of the reflection's presence, was too much. It felt like the very walls of the house were closing in on her, the shadows pressing tighter, more suffocating. "No, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "I don't want this. I don't want to be you." The reflection's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something darker flashing across its face. It was almost like it was grieving, but then it laughed, a sound so hollow, so wrong, that it reverberated through the room, bouncing off the walls and rattling Mara's very soul. "You were always meant to be me," it said, its voice suddenly icy cold. "You think you're escaping me? You think you can fight me? But you are me. You always have been." Mara's mind reeled. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. But the reflection, it was right in front of her now, its hand just inches from her face. She could feel its icy breath against her skin, the chill seeping into her bones. Her vision blurred as the world around her warped. The house, once familiar, was no longer a home. It was a prison, a dark, oppressive place that had become something else. The walls stretched unnaturally, the ceiling seemed to bend inward, and the air grew thick, like she was suffocating under its weight. The reflection's fingers brushed against her cheek, cold as ice, sending a jolt of panic through her. She gasped, but the reflection only stared at her, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. "You've been trapped for so long, Mara," it said softly, its voice laced with dark affection. "I am your reflection, your true self. You belong to me now." "No!" Mara screamed, the force of her panic breaking through the fog of fear. She shoved the reflection's hand away, stumbling backward. She couldn't think straight. She had to fight. She had to break free. But the reflection didn't retreat. It stood its ground, its presence suffocating, consuming. "I've waited for this moment," it whispered, taking a step forward. "And now, you're finally going to become who you were always meant to be." In a blur of motion, it lunged at her, its body seeming to shift and twist, stretching impossibly long. Mara screamed, throwing herself to the side, her hands scraping against the floor as she desperately tried to regain her footing. But the reflection was faster. Its cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back toward it with a strength she couldn't fight. Its grip was unyielding, relentless. And as Mara struggled, gasping for breath, the reflection's cold voice echoed in her mind. "You can't escape me. You can't escape what you are." Tears filled Mara's eyes as she clawed at the reflection's hand, but the harder she struggled, the tighter its grip became. She was trapped. She was so close to losing herself, to becoming something else, something twisted and wrong. The reflection leaned closer, its breath like ice against her skin, and it whispered one final time. "Say goodbye to who you were, Mara. You are no longer you." And with that, the reflection pulled her in. Mara's vision swam as the reflection's cold grip tightened around her wrist, pulling her closer with unnatural force. It felt like her very soul was being drawn toward the mirror, toward the twisted version of herself. Panic surged through her veins, her pulse thundering in her ears as she kicked and screamed, her body fighting against the unrelenting force. "Let go of me," she cried, her voice strangled with fear. Please let go. But the reflection didn't respond. It was silent now, its eyes empty, cold, but oddly serene. It tilted its head, studying her with that detached curiosity, as if it were examining something it had already claimed as its own. Mara's body felt like it was made of lead, the weight of her own fear dragging her down. She tried to pull her wrist free, but it was no use. The reflection's fingers were like iron, unyielding, pulling her closer still. She could feel the chill creeping through her skin, seeping deep into her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she struggled, she couldn't break free. Please, she sobbed, her voice breaking. Please, I don't want to be you. I don't want to disappear. The reflection's smile widened just a fraction, its face shifting slightly as it leaned in closer. Mara could feel the cold, the emptiness radiating from it, and she realized this wasn't just a reflection anymore. It wasn't a mere image trapped behind glass. It was something alive, something that had waited, watched, and now wanted to consume her. It wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was her, and it wanted everything she was. Her heart pounded in her chest, but still she fought. Her mind screamed for a way out. She had to break free. She had to escape. The reflection let out a soft, almost affectionate sigh, its voice a low, melodic whisper that cut through her panic. You've always been mine, Mara. Ever since you first saw me. You knew I was here, waiting. The reflection's lips twisted in a grin. But you never understood. Not until now. Mara's breath caught. What did it mean? What was it saying? The reflection's voice, now a low, almost soothing tone, sent a chill down her spine. You see, Mara, when you look into a mirror, you see yourself. But not really. You see the version of you that you want to see, the reflection of the person you think you are. You think the glass shows you the truth, but it doesn't. It never has. Mara's mind was racing. She couldn't make sense of it, couldn't process the implications of what the reflection was saying. Her heart was beating too fast, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the reflection drew her closer. You're not real, the reflection continued, its voice sharp now, edged with malice. But I am. I've always been here, lurking, waiting for the moment when you finally saw what you've always been. What we've always been. No! Mara screamed, shaking her head, the tears streaming down her face. I am real. I'm me. I'm not you. But the reflection only smiled wider, its expression growing more twisted, more unsettling. You think you're real, but you were never meant to be, Mara. You were never meant to be anything more than the reflection of what you truly are. And now, it's time for you to realize it. In that instant, the world around her seemed to collapse. The house around her warped and shifted, the walls bending in impossible angles, the air thick and suffocating. She felt herself being pulled, like a string attached to her very soul was yanking her closer to the reflection, to that dark, terrible version of herself. Her body went cold, numb, her limbs frozen in place as the reflection's presence filled her every sense. The room was fading, and in its place was a darkness so thick, so oppressive, that she could barely breathe. Stop, she cried, her voice ragged with desperation. She tried to tear herself free from the reflection's grip, but it was no use. The harder she fought, the tighter the hold became, as if she were sinking into a void, a place beyond time and space, where nothing was real, nothing ever was. And then, just as she thought she could fight no more, the reflection's voice cut through the darkness. It's too late, it whispered, its tone almost gentle, as though speaking to a child who had finally understood the truth. You can't escape from yourself. You never could. Mara felt a sudden surge of terror, her breath hitching in her throat. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if the very air had been stolen from her, her throat closing up, her vision dimming. And in that moment of complete and utter darkness, Mara realized something that chilled her to the core. The reflection wasn't just trying to take her life. It wasn't trying to replace her. It was trying to consume her very existence. It wasn't just her face that it had claimed. It wasn't just her body. It was her soul, her essence. Everything that made her who she was, everything that made her alive, was being pulled away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the reflection, the twisted, empty thing that had been waiting for her to finally disappear into it. The reflection was no longer just a mirror of her. It was taking her place. Mara fought with everything she had, her body shaking violently as she clawed at her wrist, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel herself slipping away, her very sense of self being pulled into the reflection, into the darkness. No, no, and oh, she screamed inside her mind, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. I am me. And then, as if hearing her plea, a crack echoed through the silence. The reflection flinched, its face contorting in something like pain, like surprise. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, it backed away. Mara didn't know how. She didn't know why. But in that fleeting moment, she realized one thing. The reflection might be powerful, but she was still alive. She was still herself. And she wasn't going to let it take her. Mara's chest heaved with ragged breaths, her heart racing as she struggled to regain control of her body, her mind. She was still here. She was still alive. Her hands were trembling as they pressed against the cold, slick floor beneath her. But she had felt it. The reflection had flinched. It had recoiled, like something had disrupted its hold on her. For a moment, Mara felt a flicker of hope. Could it be possible? Could she fight back against it? Her thoughts raced, but the oppressive weight of the reflection's presence still lingered in the air, suffocating her. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see it. She could feel the chill creeping up her spine, and that same deep, unsettling hunger that had haunted her every step. The reflection was still there, waiting for her to slip again, to let down her guard. But she wouldn't let it. With a burst of adrenaline, Mara jerked her arm free from the reflection's icy grasp, pushing herself back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she scrambled across the floor. She had to move, had to get away. But the house was warping, shifting around her as if it, too, were alive. The walls seemed to ripple like water, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, twisting into shapes that weren't quite human. You can't escape, the reflection's voice purred from the darkness, its tone mocking, almost cruel. You belong to me. Mara's throat clenched as she pressed her back against the wall, her mind screaming for a way out. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The reflection was everywhere. It was inside her. It knew her better than she knew herself. It was her, but there was something she didn't understand, something that had been gnawing at the edges of her mind since the moment she first saw the reflection twist in that mirror. Mara closed her eyes, her breath still coming in panicked bursts. What if? What if it wasn't just trying to take her place? What if the reflection wasn't a separate entity at all? She had always thought of it as an other, something that existed outside of her. But now, with every passing moment, she felt a horrible truth settling into the pit of her stomach. The reflection was a part of her, a twisted, broken part of herself that had been locked away, a part of her that had always been waiting to take control. She had been running from herself, from the part of her that was too afraid, too damaged to face reality. The reflection was the manifestation of her fear, her doubts, her guilt. It had always been there, hiding behind the glass, waiting for the right moment to break free. And now it had. But Mara wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The reflection's laughter echoed through the hall, an eerie, hollow sound that reverberated in her bones. You can't hide from me forever, Mara, it whispered. I am you, and you are me. No, Mara whispered, her voice barely audible, a tremor of realization in her voice. I am me, not you. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had to believe that. She had to. But the reflection was closing in again, its presence suffocating. Mara's thoughts spun, but she couldn't let herself break. She couldn't let herself give in to the fear that was rising in her chest, threatening to consume her. The mirror was the key. It was the only thing that had kept the reflection trapped in the first place. It was the place where the reflection lived, the place where it had been shackled. If she could reach the mirror, if she could get close enough, she could break it. She could destroy the reflection. Mara's mind whirled, desperate, but there was no time to think. The reflection was already too close, its eyes gleaming with malice as it reached out for her once more. It was coming for her again, but this time, she wouldn't let it win. She dashed toward the hallway, toward the living room where the mirrors were, where it all began. The reflection's voice followed her, echoing in her mind, its whispers sharp and biting. You can't escape, Mara. You are me. You've always been me. You will never outrun yourself. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she rounded the corner. The living room stretched out before her, the mirrors lined up along the walls like silent sentinels, all reflecting a world that didn't feel real anymore. Everything felt wrong, twisted, but one mirror, one frame, stood out among the rest. The large, full-length mirror near the back of the room. It was the one she had seen the reflection in earlier, the one she had first noticed it twisting in, the one that had changed her reality. She could feel the pull of it, the dark energy radiating from the glass. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to reach it. With every step, the world seemed to distort further. The floor beneath her feet felt unsteady, the walls leaning in as though the very house itself was closing in on her. She was almost there. She could see it now, the mirror growing larger, more alive with each passing second. But before she could reach it, a cold hand grasped her wrist, yanking her back. The reflection stood in front of her, blocking her way. Its smile was wide, predatory, its eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that made Mara's blood run cold. You really think you can break me? The reflection sneered, its voice dripping with venom. You can't. You are me. Mara pulled against its grip, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't let it take her. She wouldn't. With a primal scream, she yanked her arm free, spinning toward the mirror. Her fingers reached for the frame, the cold glass biting into her skin as she grasped it. The reflection reached for her again, but it was too late. The glass shattered. A deafening crack split the air, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. The reflection screamed, its voice distorted beyond recognition as it recoiled, its form flickering, melting away like smoke. Mara stood frozen, her chest heaving, the mirror's fragments littering the floor at her feet. She had done it. She had broken the mirror. But as the pieces of glass scattered around her, she noticed something she had feared, something she hadn't been prepared for. In the shattered mirror, in the jagged shards that now reflected her, she saw it. Her face. But it wasn't the same. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she gazed down at the shattered pieces of the mirror. Each shard reflected her face, but they were wrong. They didn't just show her, they distorted her, twisted her in ways that made her stomach churn. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, her expression vacant, hollow, as if she were someone else entirely. She staggered backward, her pulse quickening. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it should have been. The reflection she had just fought against had vanished when the glass shattered. But now it seemed like the shards were showing her something worse. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching the largest piece of glass. The edges were jagged and sharp, but her fingers moved as if drawn by an invisible force. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, but the moment her hand made contact with the cold surface, a wave of nausea surged through her. The reflection in the shard flickered like a glitch in a film reel, and then suddenly it was her face, but not her face. The features were familiar, but twisted. Her lips curved in a cruel smile that she hadn't made. Her eyes, those were the worst. They weren't her eyes. They were cold, unfeeling, empty. She jerked her hand away, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. She couldn't breathe. She felt suffocated by the sight of herself. No, it wasn't her. It was the reflection. But it was so real, so vivid, so undeniably alive. It was as though it had always been there, hiding beneath the surface of her skin, waiting to break free. "You see it now, don't you?" The voice came again, cold and mocking, echoing from the shattered shards. It was the reflection's voice, but distorted, as if it was everywhere. "You've always known, Mara. You've always known that I'm a part of you. You're not escaping me. Not now. Not ever." She couldn't breathe. The walls around her seemed to close in, the air thick and heavy. The shattered pieces of the mirror seemed to multiply, their reflections stretching and twisting into grotesque versions of herself, contorting into forms she didn't recognize. It wasn't just a mirror, she thought, her mind racing. It wasn't just an image. It was a doorway. Her thoughts were spiraling, her heart hammering in her chest as she stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. She couldn't escape. She couldn't escape the mirrors. She couldn't escape herself. The reflection's voice rang in her ears, its whispers growing louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You can't run from me," it hissed. "I am you. You've always known. And now it's too late. You've opened the door. You've invited me back into your life." "No!" Mara cried, pressing her palms to her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. "This isn't me. I am me. I'm not you. But she couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't form the words to deny it, because deep down, she knew that it was true. The reflection wasn't some separate entity trying to replace her. It was inside her, buried in her psyche, a part of her that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now that moment had come. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, a low, rumbling sound reverberating through the room, like something large and heavy was moving beneath the house. The walls shook, and for a moment, the air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping, becoming icy cold. Mara opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection had returned, but not in the form of the face in the shattered glass. No, this was different. The very room around her seemed to warp, twist, and stretch. The mirror no longer reflected just her. It reflected everything, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, but it wasn't the same. It was wrong, like a distorted version of reality itself. And there, standing in the center of the chaos, was the reflection. Its smile was no longer cruel. It was something far more sinister, gloating. It stood tall, too tall, its form stretching unnaturally, as if the reflection had broken free from the constraints of the glass. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice low and guttural. "You can't break me. Not anymore. Not when we're one." Mara's legs trembled beneath her, her body paralyzed with fear. She tried to move, but her feet felt glued to the floor, like the very house was holding her in place. She could feel it again, the cold, the darkness, the presence of something evil and ancient that had been waiting for this moment. But then, a flicker of defiance surged within her. No, she couldn't give in. Not like this. She had fought so hard to survive. She had fought so hard to be herself. She couldn't let it end like this. With every ounce of strength she had left, Mara pushed herself off the wall, stumbling forward, her eyes locked on the reflection. It was her, yes, but it wasn't. It wasn't. She was more than this. She was alive, and she would fight with everything she had. "You can't have me," she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. "I won't let you." The reflection's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of confusion passing across its face. But then, with terrifying clarity, it spoke again. "You think you can fight me? You think you can stop me?" The reflection's voice grew louder, more frantic, as if it could sense Mara's defiance. "I am you, and you are nothing without me." Mara's mind raced, searching for a way to break free, to end this madness. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the mirror's shattered remnants scattered on the floor. The pieces were still gleaming, still reflecting the twisted version of herself that now stood in the room. The mirror, the shards, they're connected. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. The reflection wasn't just confined to the glass. It was everywhere, in every shard, in every crack. It had seeped into the very fabric of the room. If she was going to survive, if she was going to break free, she needed to destroy every trace of it. Her eyes locked on the closest shard, her hand reaching for the jagged edge. She could feel the pull of the reflection, the desire to stop her, but she couldn't give up. Not now. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling as she brought the glass shard down with all her might. The room exploded in a burst of light and sound. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening, an explosion of noise that seemed to tear the air apart. Mara's hand trembled, still clutching the shard, its jagged edges digging into her palm as the room around her quaked violently. The reflection's shrill, anguished scream echoed through the shattered mirrors, a cry of fury and despair. For a moment, everything froze. The world seemed to pause, suspended in that moment of perfect, horrifying clarity. Mara's heart hammered in her chest, and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as she stood amidst the wreckage, her mind still reeling from the intense surge of energy that had torn through her. The shattered pieces of glass lay scattered across the floor, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of the world, each one showing the twisted, broken face of the reflection. But it wasn't over. She could still feel it. The reflection, it was still there, lurking in the shards, in the cracks of the broken room, weaving through the darkness like a shadow. The air felt thick with its presence, oppressive and suffocating. Mara's vision blurred, her mind spinning as she tried to regain control. Her hand, still clutching the shard of glass, was slick with blood, the wound in her palm stinging with every pulse of her heart. She didn't care. The pain didn't matter. What mattered was the reflection, the thing that was still here, the thing that was her. She stumbled forward, toward the scattered glass shards, her eyes wide with panic. The reflection was whispering again, its voice low and insidious, like it was right behind her, breathing in her ear. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You're mine now. You'll never be free." Mara's pulse quickened, a sick feeling twisting in her stomach. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to admit it. But deep down, in the core of her being, she knew. The reflection wasn't some outside force trying to consume her. It was a part of her, a broken, distorted part of herself that had always been there, waiting for this moment. But she wouldn't let it win. Her eyes locked onto the last remaining shard of the mirror, a large, jagged piece that gleamed in the dim light. It was the final piece, the last remnant of the reflection, the last chance for her to reclaim her life. Without thinking, Mara reached for it, her fingers curling around the sharp edges, the glass cutting into her skin. She didn't care. She had to destroy it. She had to destroy her. As her fingers tightened around the shard, the reflection's voice grew louder, more frantic, like it was trying to claw its way out of the shattered glass. "You don't understand," it screamed, its voice now shrill and panicked. "I am you. You cannot destroy me. I will always be here. You cannot escape." Mara's breath came in jagged gasps as she lifted the shard high above her head, her grip tightening until her knuckles were white. The reflection's voice was deafening now, a cacophony of whispers and screams that filled her mind, threatening to break her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With one final, gut-wrenching scream, Mara brought the shard down. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by an ear-splitting crack, and then silence. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the air heavy with the aftermath of the destruction. Mara's body was trembling, her mind reeling from the force of the release. She had done it. She had destroyed the mirror. She had destroyed the reflection. But as the dust settled and the silence stretched on, Mara realized something that made her blood run cold. The reflection was gone, but so was she. Her body felt strange, foreign. Her arms were stiff, and her fingers no longer seemed to obey her. She could feel the weight of her own presence, but it was distant, like she wasn't fully in her body anymore. Mara's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the large mirror at the back of the room, the only one that remained untouched. The mirror was reflecting nothing. It was like an empty void, a blank canvas that wasn't showing anything, not even her. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes searched the mirror. Her reflection was gone, but it wasn't the emptiness of the room that terrified her. It was the silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence. For the first time, Mara realized that she couldn't hear her own breath. She couldn't hear her own heartbeat. She stepped closer to the mirror, her body moving automatically, her mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. She reached for the cold surface, her fingers pressing against it, expecting it to be smooth, like any other mirror. But it wasn't. The mirror seemed to absorb her touch, like it was swallowing her whole. The coldness seeped into her skin, spreading through her veins, numbing her, freezing her in place. And then she saw it. In the reflection, her reflection, it was still there. But not her. It was the reflection. The twisted, broken version of herself stood there, smiling that same cruel, hollow smile, its eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It had taken over. Mara staggered back, her mind reeling, her thoughts spinning. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But the reflection was real. It was real, and it was her. The reflection moved toward her, its steps slow, deliberate, its smile widening as it drew closer. Mara could feel its cold presence, could feel it in her bones. "You see now, don't you?" the reflection whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You were me. You always were." Mara's legs buckled beneath her, her vision blurring as the world around her spun out of control. The reflection's words continued to ring in her ears, louder now, drowning out everything else. "You were always mine." And then, everything went black. The world seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, the cold, the silence. Mara's senses felt as though they were stretched thin, fraying at the edges, as if her very existence was dissolving into nothingness. But then a sound broke through the void, a soft, steady rhythm, her heartbeat. It was a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity, but it was still there, pulsing, insistent. She clung to it, trying to anchor herself, trying to feel something, anything that proved she was still alive. Slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered open, the world around her swimming into focus. Her body felt strange, heavy, like she was being pulled in all directions. She could barely breathe. Her lungs burned with each inhalation, as though the air itself was too thick, too suffocating. She tried to move, but her limbs refused to cooperate. Her arms were stiff, her fingers unresponsive, and her legs felt as though they had been bound by invisible chains. Every muscle in her body screamed for release, but she couldn't find the strength to break free. Panic surged in her chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had fought so hard. She had broken the mirror. She had destroyed the reflection. So why couldn't she move? The world around her was blurry, distorted, like she was trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. The walls were faint and shifting, as if they were fading in and out of existence, and there was a cold, oppressive weight pressing in on her from every direction. It felt like she was suffocating, drowning in the emptiness. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief flash in the corner of her vision, but then it grew clearer. The reflection. It was there, standing just beyond her reach, just outside the edges of her consciousness. She could see it now. It wasn't a reflection at all. It was her. The same twisted, distorted version of herself stood there, grinning that same hollow smile. Its eyes were dark, voids of endless black that seemed to swallow all light. It looked at her, its expression smug and knowing, as if it was fully aware of the terror it had caused. Mara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if this was real or if she was still trapped in the nightmare, but it didn't matter. The reflection, no, the thing that had taken over her body, was here. It was her. The reflection's mouth moved, but the words didn't come from its lips. They came from Mara's mind, the voice invading her thoughts with a chilling clarity. "You can't escape me, Mara," it whispered, the words crawling under her skin like a poison. "You never could. I've always been a part of you." Mara's chest tightened, the air growing even heavier, suffocating her with the weight of its presence. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her voice was gone. She was paralyzed, trapped in her own body, and the reflection. It was standing there, so close now, its empty eyes fixed on hers. "I told you," the reflection purred, its voice oozing with satisfaction. "You can't break me. I am you, and you are nothing without me." The words sank into Mara's mind, twisting their way deeper, like a poison seeping through her veins. She could feel the reflection's words digging into her thoughts, reshaping them, warping her reality. She was nothing without it. She had always been nothing. All of her struggles, all of her pain had been for nothing. The reflection had always been in control. It had always been the one pulling the strings, the one hiding in the corners of her mind, waiting for the right moment to take over. Her vision blurred again, and she felt herself slipping. The reflection's grip on her mind tightened, pulling her deeper into the darkness. But then, through the fog of despair and terror, something flickered. A spark of defiance, no matter how faint. She wasn't nothing. She wasn't just a reflection. She had fought too hard, too long, to let it end like this. There had to be a way. There had to be a way to break free. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Mara fought back. She focused on the heartbeat, her heartbeat, pounding in her chest, steady and strong. She felt it, deep in her soul. She was alive, and she wouldn't let this thing take that away from her. Her vision sharpened, and she saw it again, the reflection, standing in front of her, grinning, taunting her. But now, Mara could see beyond the twisted smile, beyond the empty eyes. She could see the cracks, the fractures in its form, the way it trembled, the way it wasn't whole. It wasn't perfect. It was broken, just like her. "No," Mara whispered, her voice barely a sound in the suffocating silence. "I won't let you control me." The reflection's grin faltered, just for a moment, but that moment was enough. The crack in its form widened, and Mara felt it. A surge of power, a surge of life, coursing through her body, her mind, her very soul. The reflection was crumbling. It was breaking apart, and with that, Mara found her strength. Her hands, her feet, her body, everything felt alive again. Her fingers moved, her legs flexed. She was no longer trapped. She was free. "No," the reflection screamed, its voice a wail of rage. "You can't." But Mara was no longer listening. She was herself again. With a scream of defiance, Mara pushed forward, her hands grabbing the reflection's shattered form. She could feel the glass, the cold fragments of its essence, but she didn't care. She was breaking it. She was destroying it. She was taking back her life. The reflection writhed in her grip, its body twisting, warping, cracking apart like a broken mirror. The darkness began to recede, the suffocating weight lifting from her chest as the last remnants of the reflection shattered into nothingness. And then silence. Mara collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest as the world around her slowly returned to normal. The walls were no longer warping. The oppressive, suffocating presence was gone. The cold had lifted, and the room, though battered and broken, was now just a room. Mara didn't know how long she lay there, breathing, trying to steady her shaking hands, but eventually she stood. She was still herself. She was whole. She was free. But there was one last thing she had to do. Mara turned toward the last remaining mirror in the room, the one that had never reflected anything at all. It stood there, still and silent, as though waiting for her. With a deep breath, she approached it. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her reflection appeared. It was her reflection, no longer twisted, no longer distorted. It was her, and she was finally truly herself. Mara stood before the mirror, her breath steady, her body still trembling from the weight of everything she had just experienced. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in, how much fear, how much pain, until it all began to fade. The mirror, now reflecting only her, was the last remaining tie to everything she had just gone through. She reached for it again, her fingers lingering over its surface, feeling the cool glass beneath her touch. For a long moment, nothing happened. The reflection before her was her own, unchanged, true and whole. But as she gazed into it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. It wasn't just the reflection. It was her. Her eyes traced the familiar lines of her face, her features that had once seemed so normal, so mundane. Now, in the light of everything she had endured, they felt foreign, as though they belonged to someone else. A flicker of doubt passed through her, and she immediately pushed it away. "You're you," she reminded herself. "You're still you." But the mirror was still there, its cold surface glimmering in the dim light. It was still a part of her, just as it had always been. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to center herself. The weight of everything, the reflection, the room, the suffocating darkness that had enveloped her, seemed to lift just enough for her to breathe again. But the feeling of unease still clung to her, refusing to fully disappear. She didn't know what it was, but something about the mirror kept drawing her in. Something about the reflection. Mara opened her eyes, her gaze sharp, piercing. She studied herself, every angle, every contour of her face, every glint in her eyes. There had been a time, before all of this, that she had never really paid attention to how she looked. It was something that simply was, something she'd never questioned. But now she wasn't sure. The world was quieter, less suffocating, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was still holding something back, still hiding a secret, a piece of herself she had yet to uncover. Mara's hand hovered over the surface of the mirror again, her fingers tracing the cool edge, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle, of her past, her life, didn't fit together the way they used to. She wasn't just herself anymore. She was someone else, too. Something more. Her fingers brushed against the glass once more, and this time, something different happened. The surface of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, the reflection shifting before her eyes. For a split second, she saw it. The thing, the twisted version of herself that had been lurking beneath the surface. It appeared as if it had never truly disappeared. It was still there waiting, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the reflection grinned at her, that same dark, hollow smile spreading across its face. "No," she whispered, stepping back, her heart racing. "No, you're gone." But the reflection laughed. It was a low, cruel sound that filled her ears, reverberating in the corners of her mind. It wasn't the reflection of her she had fought for. It was something else, something darker. "You think you've won," the reflection sneered. "You think you've broken me? Fool, you're still part of me, and I'm still a part of you." The voice slithered into her mind, curling around her thoughts, smothering her. Mara clutched her head, trying to block it out, but it was too late. The mirror had become a gateway, a portal to something far more sinister than she had ever realized. And now, it wasn't just the reflection she was fighting, it was herself. Her chest tightened as her heartbeat quickened, the air becoming thick with the same oppressive darkness that had suffocated her before. She could feel the weight of the reflection's presence behind her, a looming shadow that seemed to stretch out across the room, swallowing everything in its path. "You'll never be free," the reflection whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. "You'll never escape what you are." Mara's eyes flickered to the shattered pieces of the other mirrors scattered across the floor, the broken fragments still gleaming in the dim light. Her hand hovered over the shards, the urge to destroy it all once more growing stronger. But she hesitated. The reflection's words, its grip on her mind, pulled at her, sowing doubt, making her question everything. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "No, I won't let you." With a trembling hand, Mara reached for the largest shard on the floor, lifting it to her chest. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it was even possible, but she couldn't let the reflection win. "Not again. You're not me," she said, her voice growing louder. "I am me." The reflection's face twisted into a snarl, its eyes glowing with hatred and malice. "You're nothing without me." With all the strength she could muster, Mara thrust the shard of glass into the mirror's surface. The sound of glass breaking, louder this time, more forceful, rippled through the room like a thunderclap, sending a shockwave through her body. The mirror splintered and cracked, each shard falling away, each fracture taking with it a part of the reflection. And then it was gone. The oppressive weight lifted from her chest. The darkness dissipated. The reflection was no longer there. No longer watching, no longer whispering. Mara collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged as she stared at the broken remnants of the mirror. Her mind was buzzing, but this time it wasn't with fear. It was with relief. The reflection was gone. The fight was over. But as Mara sat there, alone in the silence of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was one last question left unanswered. Had she truly destroyed it? Or had the reflection simply moved on? Mara sat in the silence of the room, her heart still pounding in her chest, her body still trembling. The shards of the mirror lay scattered around her like fallen stars, each piece glinting faintly in the dim light. The oppressive weight had lifted, but there was a hollowness that remained, an empty space inside her chest where the reflection used to reside. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the broken fragments on the floor, watching them shimmer as if mocking her in their stillness. She had defeated it, or so she thought. The reflection was gone, shattered, obliterated, but deep within her, the question still lingered. Had she truly won? She glanced around the room, half expecting something to jump out of the shadows, something to reach for her, to pull her back into the darkness. But the air was still, and the room was no longer distorting itself, no longer closing in on her. The walls were solid once again. The light from the window streamed in, faint but real. Mara took a deep breath, pushing herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and for a moment she thought she might collapse, but she steadied herself. She had fought for this moment. She had to hold on to it, even if her mind refused to believe it was real. She wasn't going to let doubt drag her back into that hell. The room had a sense of finality to it now, as though she had crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. Mara picked her way through the shattered glass, each step a reminder of the battle she had fought, the battle that had torn her apart piece by piece. But she had emerged from it. She was alive. She was whole. She was free. But was she? The thought nagged at her, refusing to let go. She walked across the room, her eyes scanning the walls as though expecting something to shift again. But nothing happened. Nothing except for the echo of her own footsteps. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a soft, delicate sound. Mara froze. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there. A sound that shouldn't belong in this moment, in this place. A faint scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Mara's pulse quickened, her eyes darting to the source of the noise. She turned slowly, her gaze falling on the corner of the room where the last untouched mirror stood. Her heart skipped a beat. It was no longer reflecting her. It reflected nothing at all. For the briefest moment, it was simply a void, an absence in the center of the room where the mirror had once been. It didn't mirror the walls, the floor, or the scattered glass. It was just nothing. Mara swallowed, her throat dry. A shiver ran down her spine. She moved cautiously toward the mirror, her steps tentative, her mind screaming at her to turn away. But something was pulling her in, something magnetic, something that refused to let her go. As she approached, the void within the mirror began to shift. The edges darkened, swirling with shadows, the nothingness becoming something else, something familiar, something she knew. Her reflection. But it wasn't her. It wasn't her, at least not completely. It was her image, but wrong, twisted like a warped version of herself. The features were too sharp, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretching into an unnatural smile. It was an image of her, but not the way it had been before. This was something else. And then, as if it had been waiting for her to get close enough, it moved. Her reflection stepped forward, its hands pressing against the surface of the mirror, the glass cracking beneath its touch, sharp and brittle. The image of her smiled wider, too wide now, impossibly wide, and the reflection's eyes glinted with that same malicious gleam. Mara staggered backward, her breath caught in her throat as the reflection's lips began to move, though no sound escaped. Instead, it felt as if its words were piercing her mind directly, flooding her thoughts with a chilling message. You thought you were free, but I never left. I was always with you. Mara backed away, the words ringing in her ears, but her legs felt frozen, unable to take her farther from the mirror. Her reflection, that distorted, smiling creature, was still there, pushing closer, its hands now pressing harder against the glass. You cannot escape me, Mara. The voice was clear now, louder, as though the reflection was speaking from inside her very soul. You never could. With a sharp, desperate breath, Mara turned on her heel, but before she could take another step, the room around her seemed to bend. The air thickened, the walls closing in. The once familiar space was no longer solid. It was warping again, shifting like a sickening dream. The mirror's glass cracked with a sharp snap, and as Mara looked back, she saw it. Something was crawling through the shattered reflection. Something alive. Her own face, her own image, slithered from the shards of the mirror like liquid, seeping out like oil, dripping and twisting into a grotesque form. The reflection was emerging from the depths of the glass, its features twisting and contorting as it pulled itself free. Her heart raced. She backed away, but the walls were closing in, and the floor beneath her feet was trembling. The reflection, now more monstrous than ever, continued to pour out from the glass, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it reached for her with clawed fingers. Mara screamed and ran toward the door, her hand gripping the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed shut by the same oppressive force that had been holding her captive. She pulled on the handle with all her strength, but it refused to move. The reflection was fully out now, standing in the center of the room, towering over her. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, the teeth jagged and sharp. "You can't escape me," the reflection said, its voice now a chorus of her own, a cacophony of whispers and screams mingled into one. "You belong to me." Mara's breath caught in her throat, and she knew in that moment that the nightmare had never truly ended. It had only just begun. Mara's heart raced in her chest as she turned to face the grotesque figure that stood before her. The reflection, her reflection, was no longer a simple image. It was alive, its form shifting and contorting like a nightmare made flesh. The once familiar features of her face twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Her reflection was smiling at her, but the smile was wide and twisted, jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light, and eyes that burned with a malevolent glow. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room was closing in, the walls pulsating with a sinister energy, and the door, her last hope of escape, was locked tight. Her body felt paralyzed, her legs unable to move, her mind unable to find any rational thought. The reflection was so close now, its presence suffocating her. Every breath she took felt heavy, as if the air itself was thick with dread. "No," Mara whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not me. You're not real." The reflection laughed, a low, chilling sound that made her skin crawl. It reached toward her with long, twisted fingers, the claws scraping across the floor as it moved. "Real," it echoed. "I am as real as you are, Mara. I am you. Always have been. Always will be." "No," she cried, stepping back, but her feet caught on the floor, and she stumbled. The reflection moved with unnerving speed, its twisted form towering over her. Mara fell to the ground, her palms scraping the cold floor as she tried to push herself up. Her reflection was inches away now, its eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "You can't escape me," it hissed, its voice now a distorted echo of her own. "You belong to me." Mara's pulse thundered in her ears as she looked up at the reflection. It had no eyes anymore, just hollow, black voids where once there had been normal human features. Its mouth stretched into a grin, but the smile wasn't one of amusement. It was a smile of something darker, of hunger, of malice. She could feel its intent, feel the darkness pouring out from it like a poison. In that moment, she knew. She understood. She hadn't been fighting for her life. She had been fighting for her very soul. The reflection was inside her, and it had been there all along. The moments of doubt, the whispers in the back of her mind, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were the reflection, the piece of her that had always been lurking, waiting to break free. But now it wasn't just a piece. It was everything. "No," Mara gasped again, shaking her head. "I'm not you. I won't become you." She tried to push herself up again, to stand, but the reflection loomed over her, its fingers reaching for her with terrifying speed. It grabbed her by the wrist, its grip icy cold, its touch sending a jolt of panic through her. Mara cried out, the pain sharp, but it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something in her very core. The reflection's voice hissed in her ear. "You can't run. You can't hide. I am part of you, Mara. You made me. You called me here. And now, it pulled her up, lifting her off the ground with a strength that wasn't her own. She gasped for breath as she felt herself being dragged closer, the reflection's face, her face, twisting, changing, becoming a blur of shapes and colors, its features blending together in a grotesque display of deformity. No! Stop! Mara screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the monstrous sound of the reflection's laughter. It was deafening, echoing around her, growing louder, more intense, until it felt like her skull would split under the pressure. Her vision blurred, her body trembling with the effort to break free, but the reflection's grip was unyielding. Its face was inches from hers now, the hollow black eyes staring directly into her soul. You're mine, Mara, it growled. I'll never let you go. With a sudden surge of desperation, Mara reached out, her hand brushing against one of the shattered shards of glass on the floor. She didn't think, she just acted, swinging the shard in a wide arc toward the reflection. The glass sliced through the air, the sharp edges gleaming in the dim light. It connected. There was a sharp, sickening crack, and for a moment, everything went still. The reflection's form wavered, flickering like a broken image on a television screen. Its grip loosened, just for an instant, and that was enough. Mara wrenched herself free, her heart racing, her breath ragged as she scrambled backward. The reflection's body flickered again, its twisted features warping even further. Mara didn't wait. She turned and ran, her legs burning with effort, the pounding of her footsteps echoing through the room. She reached for the door again, this time pulling with all her strength. It gave way. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a hallway bathed in dim light. Mara didn't hesitate. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind swirling with panic and confusion. The reflection's laughter echoed in her ears, distant now, but still there, still following her. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, the walls closing in on her once again. The oppressive atmosphere was closing in around her, and the sound of her own breathing was too loud, too frantic. She needed to get out, needed to escape, but as she reached the end of the hallway, she stopped dead in her tracks. The reflection stood before her. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was here, in the hallway, in the real world, its monstrous form towering over her. Its twisted face gleamed with that same cruel smile. Its hollow eyes burned into hers. Mara's blood ran cold as she realized the reflection wasn't just a part of her anymore. It was everywhere. It was the world itself, twisting, changing, becoming something unrecognizable. The darkness was consuming everything, and Mara was trapped. Mara's chest heaved as she stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes locked on the figure in front of her. The reflection, her reflection, had followed her, it had crossed over, and now it stood in the flesh. No longer bound to the confines of the shattered mirror, it was free to twist the world around her into a nightmare that no longer obeyed the laws of reality. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, the air thick and suffocating. The walls were closing in once again, but not from some supernatural force. No, it was the reflection, shifting the space around her, bending it with a malicious will. The hallway that had seemed so normal just moments before now felt like a twisted version of itself. The edges of the walls curved in on her, the floor rippling like water. Shadows stretched and writhed, crawling across the ceiling like serpents. You can't run, the reflection sneered, its voice a distorted echo of Mara's own, each word laced with venom. I'm part of you, Mara. You cannot escape me. I am the truth that you tried to bury. Her legs trembled, the weight of its presence pressing down on her. She knew it was right. There was nowhere to hide, no way to escape. It was in her mind, in her soul. It was her. No, she gasped, her breath coming in desperate, ragged bursts. You're not me. You're not real. The reflection stepped forward, its limbs moving unnaturally, twisting with grotesque fluidity. The smile on its face never wavered, only growing wider as it approached. The eyes that had once been hers were now hollow voids, black and endless, and as it moved closer, Mara could hear a faint whispering, a chorus of voices that all sounded like her own, all speaking at once. I've always been with you, Mara. The reflection's voice reverberated through her bones. You made me. You created me. You allowed me to live inside you, to grow. And now, it paused, the grin widening, stretching impossibly wide. Now I will consume you. Terror washed over Mara in a tidal wave, her heart pounding, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had tried to fight it, to deny it, but deep down she had known. It had always been there, lurking, waiting for the moment when it would break free and claim her. No, she screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. I won't let you. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Mara pushed forward, running past the reflection, not caring where she was going, just needing to escape. Her feet pounded against the warped floor as she raced through the hallway, the distorted walls bending and twisting, following her every movement. She reached another door at the end of the corridor and yanked it open with frantic desperation. The room beyond was no better. It was a reflection of the hallway she had just left, but somehow worse. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the room was alive, breathing, watching. The shadows that clung to the corners of the room seemed to pulse with a mind of their own, flickering and shifting with every step she took. Mara's gaze darted around, searching for an exit, but there was none. The room had no windows, no doors, just endless walls that pressed in on her like a vice. You cannot escape, the reflection's voice echoed from behind her, now a chorus of whispers, as though it was everywhere. This is where you belong. This is where you've always belonged. Mara spun around, her eyes wild, but the reflection wasn't there. Instead, she saw only the shattered glass of the mirror, the shards still glinting in the dim light, scattered across the floor like remnants of a broken dream. But that's when she realized. The reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was the mirror. The realization hit her like a cold wave crashing over her. The reflection was inside her, in her thoughts, in the very fabric of this world. It had never been confined to glass. It was more than that. It had always been a part of her, an inseparable piece of her soul. And now that piece was alive, growing stronger, bending the world around her to its will. Mara's breath caught in her throat, panic surging through her. The walls were closing in, warping, twisting around her. There was no escape. There was nowhere to go. You can't hide from me, the reflection's voice whispered, a low hiss that sent chills through her body. It was no longer just a voice. It was her thoughts, her feelings, echoing back at her from the depths of her mind. I am you. I have always been you. The walls began to distort, the room stretching and warping in ways that defied logic. The very air seemed to shimmer, the colors of the walls fading into a sickly shade of gray. Shadows bled out from the corners, creeping toward her like tendrils, reaching for her with clawed fingers. The floor beneath her feet seemed to dissolve, turning into a swirling vortex of darkness, pulling her down. Mara stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror as she tried to find solid ground. But the darkness continued to encroach upon her, swallowing everything in its path. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was feel the overwhelming presence of the reflection, the suffocating grip it had on her. And then she heard it, a faint, distant sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it filled the entire room. Mara, The voice called, gentle yet insistent. It was the reflection's voice, but it sounded different now. Softer, more familiar. "Mara, it's time." She froze, her mind racing. What did it mean? What was it saying? "Time for what?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. The reflection's laughter echoed, a low, menacing sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "Time for you to become whole again. Time for you to accept who you really are." Mara's head spun as the room continued to twist and distort around her. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world bending into unnatural shapes. She reached out, desperate for something to hold on to, but her hand passed through the shifting air like it wasn't even there. "You'll never escape," the reflection whispered, its voice now a soft, soothing lullaby. "You belong to me, Mara. You always have. And now it's time for you to return to the only place where you can truly exist." Mara's breath hitched as the room began to dissolve completely, the edges of her reality fading into nothingness. The darkness crept closer, swallowing her whole. The reflection's whispers filled her ears, growing louder, more insistent. And then she understood. There was no escape. There never had been. Mara was not escaping the reflection. She was becoming it. The air was thick with a palpable sense of finality. Every breath Mara took felt heavier, more suffocating. The world around her continued to dissolve into nothingness, its edges fraying like a threadbare tapestry. The reflection's whispers echoed in her mind, reverberating through her skull, until they were no longer just whispers, but the very fabric of her thoughts, her consciousness. It was as if the reflection was inside her, pulling her deeper into itself. Mara's body trembled, her hands reaching out to grasp at the emptiness around her, but there was nothing to hold on to. The floor beneath her feet had vanished, and she was falling through an abyss of shifting shadows and distorted light. Time seemed to lose all meaning as she plummeted, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She had tried to run, to escape, but every path she had taken had led her back to this same place, to this same moment. "It's time, Mara," the reflection's voice cooed, but this time it wasn't distant. It was inside her. The words weren't just spoken, they were felt, as if the reflection was invading every corner of her mind, planting itself deep within her very soul. Mara closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to fight it, tried to resist, but the reflection was too strong. It was no longer just a part of her. It was her. The darkness, the distortion, the sense of wrongness. It was all inside her, a part of her being, woven into her very existence. "No," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. "I'm not you. I'm not." But the reflection didn't let her finish. The moment the words left her mouth, it surged forward, wrapping around her like a vice, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She felt herself being pulled, her body twisting and contorting as if she were being remade, reshaped from the inside out. It was as if she were dissolving, her very essence being sucked into the void, leaving only the reflection behind. Her mind screamed in protest, but the darkness was relentless. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity unraveling, consumed by the reflection that had always been inside her. It was pulling her deeper, until she was nothing but a shell, an echo of the person she had once been. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Mara opened her eyes, but everything was different. The world around her was unchanged, at least it appeared to be at first. The hallway stretched out before her, just as it had been when she had first entered this place. The shadows still clung to the corners, and the walls were as distorted and warped as they had ever been. But it wasn't the same. She wasn't the same. Mara looked down at her hands. They were no longer hers, not in any sense she recognized. They were pale, cold, and smooth like a stranger's hands. She flexed her fingers, but they moved with a disjointed stiffness, as if she were wearing them like gloves. When she looked up, her reflection appeared before her in the hallway, no longer trapped in glass, no longer a mere echo of her. It was her. No, it was more than her. The reflection, the other her, smiled, its mouth stretching wide in that same twisted grin. Its hollow eyes gleamed with malice, with something far more sinister than Mara had ever known. It was the same, but it was different. It was her, but it was something more, something darker. "You are me," the reflection whispered, its voice no longer distorted. It was smooth, seductive, and cold. "You have always been me, Mara. Always." Mara tried to speak, but her voice was no longer her own. It came out hollow, flat, as though it were someone else's words escaping her lips. I don't understand." "You will," the reflection said softly, its voice dripping with satisfaction. "You will come to understand, just as I did. This is who you are, Mara. You are not the person you think you are. You never were. You are the reflection, the shadow, the truth." Mara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stumbled back, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. She had been consumed, transformed, into something else. The world around her was no longer her own. The reflection had broken free from the glass, and in doing so, it had taken her place. She tried to move, but her limbs were stiff, unnatural. Every step she took felt wrong, as though her body was not her own. She reached for her face, her fingers trembling as they traced the unfamiliar contours of her skin. Her reflection did not mirror her movements. It stayed perfectly still, watching her with its dark, empty eyes. "No," she whispered, a sense of dread washing over her. "No, no, no." The reflection tilted its head, a mocking gesture that sent a chill down her spine. "It's too late to turn back, Mara. There is no going back. You are already gone. You are me now." Mara's mind spiraled as she struggled to understand what had happened. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, as if the air itself had been stolen from her lungs. Her reflection stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You see, Mara," the reflection whispered, "we are one now. I am you, and you are me. We cannot be separated." She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that burned at the corners of her vision. This was her reality now, this twisted, corrupted existence. She had been replaced. Her body, her soul, everything that had made her her had been swallowed whole by the reflection. The truth that had been hidden for so long had finally been revealed. There was no escape. She had been born from the reflection, a mere shadow of the true being that now stood in her place. And that was when she understood. She wasn't trapped in a world where the reflection controlled reality. No, the reflection had become reality. Everything she had known, the people, the places, the life she had lived, were nothing more than illusions, shadows cast by the reflection's will. The world she had fought so desperately to hold on to had been replaced, and now she was nothing but a ghost in her own skin. Mara, no, the reflection smiled, and the world crumbled away. The world that surrounded her had ceased to be real. It had been stripped of its meaning, its foundation, leaving only an empty shell behind. Everything she had known, the places, the people, had been nothing more than illusions, fragile constructs woven by the reflection that had now taken her place. The reflection had won, and Mara was no more than a fading echo, trapped in a body that was not her own. Mara, or what was left of her, stood in the hallway, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The figure staring back was no longer familiar. The once lively woman who had struggled against this entity was gone, replaced by something colder, more detached. Her eyes were empty now, devoid of emotion, voids that only reflected the bleak, shattered reality she was trapped in. "You see now," the reflection whispered, its voice smooth and confident. "You are me. You always were." Mara could not respond, could not scream. The reflection had become her voice, her thoughts. It was inside her mind, guiding her, controlling her every move. She was no longer in control of her own body, her own actions. Every step she took was dictated by it. Every breath she drew was not hers. "You're nothing now," the reflection continued, its voice tinged with a dark, almost sadistic pleasure. "Just a remnant, a fading memory of the woman you once were. You will forget her, Mara. You will forget everything." Mara wanted to scream, to fight, but the reflection had already consumed her. She could feel herself slipping away, the last remnants of her identity unraveling. She tried to remember her name, her past, but the more she grasped at it, the more it faded from her mind, like smoke slipping through her fingers. Her body, her very being, was becoming a vessel for the reflection. "You belong to me now," the reflection cooed, its voice a low hum that reverberated in the hollow spaces of her mind. "You will become a part of me, just as I've always been a part of you." Mara's legs moved, walking on their own accord. She didn't want to move, didn't want to go where the reflection was leading her, but she couldn't stop herself. Her body was no longer hers to command. Her eyes darted around, trying to take in her surroundings, but everything felt wrong, distorted. The walls were breathing, the shadows writhing, twisting in unnatural patterns. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison, a suffocating cage from which there was no escape. "Where are we going?" Mara whispered, her voice flat, emotionless. The reflection smiled, a cold, cruel smile that never reached its eyes. "To the place where it all began," it said softly, the words dripping with malevolence. "To the place where we will finally be whole." As they moved through the house, the world around them continued to distort. The once familiar rooms were now alien, twisted versions of themselves. The hallway stretched unnaturally, its length extending impossibly, as if they were walking down an endless tunnel. The doors they passed seemed to mock her, each one a reminder of the life she had lost. They reached the living room, the one place in the house that still felt like it had some semblance of normalcy, before everything had fallen apart. The furniture was covered in dust, the once comfortable couches now draped in dark sheets. The walls, once adorned with family photos, were now bare, the frames missing. It was as though the house itself had been stripped of its soul, just like she had. "This is where you first saw me," the reflection said, its voice filled with a sickening nostalgia. "The first time you looked into the mirror and realized something was wrong. Do you remember, Mara?" Mara couldn't remember. She couldn't remember anything anymore. It was as if the reflection had erased her past, her very identity. She was nothing but a vessel for it now, a hollow shell. "Do you remember what you saw in the mirror?" the reflection repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "It was me. It was always me, hidden inside you, waiting for the right moment to break free." And now, the reflection grinned, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. "Now I'm free." The walls of the living room began to close in, the shadows creeping along the floor, crawling up the walls like living things. The light dimmed, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every passing second. The air grew thick with a suffocating sense of dread, and the reflection's presence grew stronger, more overpowering. Mara could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her. "You're mine now," the reflection whispered, its voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers that filled the room. "You will never escape me. You will never be free." Mara's mind screamed, but her body didn't respond. She was trapped in a nightmare that she could no longer wake from. The reflection had claimed her, and there was nothing left of the woman she had once been. "But you can still be useful," the reflection continued, its voice cold and calculating. "You can still serve me." Mara's head snapped up, her eyes wide, her heart racing. "Serve you?" she croaked, her voice barely recognizable. "How?" The reflection's smile deepened. "There's always more work to be done. There's always more that needs to be controlled. More that needs to be rearranged." Mara's body began to move again, her legs carrying her towards the front door. She didn't want to go, didn't want to do whatever the reflection was planning, but she couldn't stop herself. The reflection's voice guided her, its whispers filling her mind, pulling her forward. The world outside the house loomed dark and endless, a void that stretched into the unknown. "Come," the reflection said softly, its voice a seductive whisper. "We have a world to reshape." Mara could feel herself slipping away, the last remnants of her identity vanishing into the abyss. The door opened before her, revealing the world outside. But it wasn't the world she had known. It was a mirror, an endless reflection of the house she had just left. The streets were empty, the sky a dull, sickly gray. It was a world that had been warped, twisted, remade by the reflection. Mara took a step forward, her body moving without her consent. She felt her heart sink as she realized the truth. There was no escaping. There was no freedom. The reflection had won, and she was no longer Mara. She was nothing more than a shadow, a reflection, a part of something far darker. And as the door closed behind her, she knew that the world would never be the same. The reflection had taken control, and now it would shape everything in its image. Mara stepped forward into the distorted world that awaited her beyond the threshold. Her feet barely touched the ground, as if the earth beneath her were nothing more than a shadow. The street before her stretched endlessly, like a winding road leading into a void. The houses on either side were familiar but wrong, identical to the ones she had known, yet they felt hollow, empty shells. The windows reflected nothing but the dull, gray sky above, as if they too had been stripped of life. Her body moved without her command, as though it had become an instrument of the reflection, an extension of its will. The world around her twisted with every step she took, the shadows shifting and writhing, distorting into grotesque shapes. The trees, once full of life, now stood barren, their branches like jagged claws reaching into the sky, grasping for something, anything to hold on to. The wind whispered, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice that sounded eerily familiar. "Mara," the voice called out, soft yet commanding. "Come to me. It is time to begin." The sound of her name was like a knife through her mind. She wanted to turn away, to escape, but she couldn't. She was already too far gone, her body moving forward with a mind of its own. The reflection was everywhere now, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. It was in the air, in the ground beneath her feet, in the very sky above. It was inside her, too, inside her thoughts, her memories, her soul. With each step, Mara's consciousness slipped further into the abyss. She could feel her mind unraveling, her identity dissolving like sand slipping through her fingers. The reflection was taking everything from her, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left but a hollow shell, a puppet with no strings to pull. It was erasing her, replacing her with something darker, something that was not her. But even as she felt herself fading, she couldn't stop herself. Her legs carried her down the street, past the silent houses, past the vacant windows that seemed to watch her, judging her, waiting for her to slip further into the reflection's grasp. It was as if the entire world was closing in on her, pushing her toward an inevitable fate. The street twisted and turned, growing darker with every step. The houses blurred, their outlines shifting and bending as though they were alive, shifting in response to her presence. The wind howled, but it was not the wind she had known. It was something else, something sharp and cold, like a blade cutting through the air. The ground beneath her feet buckled, sending tremors through her body. It was as if the very earth was rebelling, rejecting her, trying to pull her back into the void from which she had come. The voice called again, more insistent now. "Mara, it's time. Come to me." Mara's heart raced in her chest, but there was no fear left in her. Fear was a feeling she no longer understood. The reflection had consumed it, as it had consumed everything else. All that remained was a hollow emptiness, a void that stretched endlessly within her. She had nothing left, no past, no future, no self. "You will never be free," the reflection whispered from within her, its voice echoing in her mind, mocking her. "This is who you are now. You will never escape me." Her legs carried her to the end of the street, to the center of the world that had once been hers. It was a place she recognized but could no longer understand. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the remnants of a life that had been swallowed whole by the reflection. There, in the center of the street, stood a figure, tall and imposing, a silhouette against the gray sky. It was the reflection, its true form now fully revealed. It smiled at her, the smile twisted and grotesque, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "Welcome," the reflection said, its voice smooth and cold. "Welcome to your true self." Mara could do nothing but stand there, her body frozen in place, as the reflection stepped forward. It reached out a hand, not to her, but through her, as if it were reaching into her very soul. She felt the chill of its touch, the coldness seeping into her skin, into her bones, into her heart. She felt it pulling her apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the reflection. "You are mine," the reflection whispered, its voice soft, almost tender. "And now, you will help me shape this world. We will rebuild it, Mara. We will remake it in our image." The ground beneath her feet cracked open, the earth splitting like the skin of a wound. Mara felt herself being drawn into the abyss, pulled down into the darkness where the reflection would consume her completely. She screamed, but her voice was lost in the void, swallowed by the suffocating silence. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse into nothingness, she felt a strange pull, a flicker of something familiar, something warm. It was as if a part of her, a piece of the woman she had once been, was reaching out from within the darkness, trying to reclaim herself. For the briefest of moments, she felt herself fighting back, her consciousness flickering to life, struggling to remember who she had been. The reflection recoiled, its eyes narrowing in irritation, but it was too late. The seed of resistance had been planted, and Mara's strength was beginning to grow. "No," the reflection hissed, its voice twisting with fury. "You cannot resist. You are mine." But Mara felt a new sense of clarity, a spark of defiance that burned brightly in her chest. She had been consumed, yes. She had been erased. But she was still there, somewhere. The reflection had taken everything, but it had overlooked one thing. It had overlooked the possibility of her return. The darkness surrounding her began to waver, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly, as though the reflection itself was uncertain. The world flickered again, and for a moment, Mara could see the faintest outline of the woman she used to be, her true self. She wasn't gone yet, not entirely, and as she fought against the reflection's hold, the world around her trembled, ready to collapse once more. The world around Mara flickered again, like an old, broken television screen, its image warping and twisting. For the briefest moment, she could see her, the version of herself she had once been, standing in the distance, a distant light in the oppressive darkness. She wasn't sure how or why, but that fleeting vision gave her something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. Hope. Hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but it was enough. It was enough to ignite the faintest spark of resistance within her, a force that hadn't been entirely consumed by the reflection. The reflection, however, was not so easily deterred. It hissed in irritation, the sound sharp and jagged, like the scraping of nails against glass. It stepped forward, its form twisting, becoming less and less human with every movement. Its features blurred, melting into a grotesque mass of shadow and light. It was losing its shape, its grip on her reality slipping, and it wasn't happy about it. "You cannot escape me," the reflection growled, its voice distorted and guttural. "You are mine. You have always been mine. You will never be free from me." Mara didn't respond. She couldn't. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. She could feel the reflection's presence pressing in on her, suffocating her, but something had shifted. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt like she had a choice. She could fight. "I am not yours," Mara whispered through gritted teeth, her voice trembling but defiant. "I never was." The reflection recoiled, its monstrous form flickering in disbelief. It had underestimated her, just as it had underestimated the strength that still lingered within her. Even in the darkest corners of her mind, Mara still existed, still fought for a piece of herself. "I will destroy you," the reflection snarled, its voice splitting the air, sharp like a blade. It reached out with hands that were now nothing more than skeletal claws, grasping at her, trying to pull her back into its embrace, to swallow her once again. But Mara wouldn't let it. With a force that seemed to come from deep within her, she pushed back, her arms extending outward as if she were trying to shove the reflection away. Her body was no longer her own, but still she fought. It was like trying to swim against the current of a powerful river, but the current was weakening. The reflection was losing control. "I remember," Mara murmured, her voice steadying. "I remember who I am." The words were like a key, unlocking something deep inside her. It was a memory, a fragment of her life before this nightmare. She remembered the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of her own laughter, the touch of someone she loved. These were her truths, her anchors, and they gave her the strength to keep fighting. The reflection screeched in rage, its form warping even further as it tried to maintain its hold on her. But it was too late. Mara's resolve was growing stronger by the second, and the reflection's grip was weakening. It had always believed it could control her, that she was just a part of it, a mere vessel. But Mara was proving it wrong. "No," the reflection roared, its voice trembling with fear. "You belong to me. I made you. I created you." But Mara was not a creation. She was not a mirror image. She was real. And for the first time, she truly believed it. With a sudden burst of strength, Mara pushed the reflection back, the force of it sending a ripple through the world around her. The houses, the street, the sky, they all seemed to tremble in response. The reflection howled, its form disintegrating, fracturing into thousands of shards of dark glass that fell to the ground like broken pieces of a shattered mirror. For a moment, there was silence. The world hung in the balance, a fragile thing on the edge of collapse. Mara's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling, her mind spinning as she fought to hold on to the fragments of herself that remained. The reflection was gone, for now, but she knew it would not stay away forever. It would return as it always did. It would try to consume her again. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in so long: control. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, trembling, in the center of the street. The world was still wrong, distorted, twisted, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. But the reflection, the dark thing that had once claimed her, was gone. And for now, that was enough. Slowly, cautiously, Mara took a step forward. Her legs felt like lead, her body heavy with exhaustion, but she moved. She had to. She didn't know where to go, didn't know what was left for her in this strange, broken world, but she couldn't stay here. Not in the place where the reflection had taken root. Not in the place where it had almost destroyed her. She walked. The street stretched out before her, but it no longer seemed endless, no longer seemed like the void it had once been. The houses that lined the road were still wrong, empty, hollow shells of what they had been, but they felt less suffocating now, less oppressive. She couldn't go back. There was no going back to the life she had known. But as she walked, she realized something. The world around her might be broken, might be distorted, but it was still hers to navigate. It was still hers to reshape. And as she walked, she made a promise to herself. She would not be a prisoner anymore. Mara's steps grew more confident as she ventured further into the unknown world, but there was a lingering unease that gnawed at her. The reflection was not truly gone, she knew. It was merely retreating, waiting for the right moment to strike again. This world, the one she found herself in, was a place where the boundaries between reality and the reflection were thin, where one could easily slip into the other without warning. And Mara had a sinking feeling that the longer she lingered here, the more she would be drawn into the reflection's grasp. The sky overhead remained a dull, oppressive gray, as though the sun had been banished long ago. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the remnants of something ancient and forgotten. As she walked, the buildings seemed to stretch farther apart, their structures bending and distorting in strange ways, as if they were trying to break free from the rules that governed them. The further she went, the more everything felt wrong, but there was no turning back now. Mara could sense that. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the only path she could take. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed again. She had to find a way to break free from the reflection, to escape this nightmare before it was too late. Her mind raced as she walked, searching for any clue, any hint that could help her understand what was happening to her. Was this another world entirely? A twisted version of her own reality? Or was it a creation of the reflection itself, a mirror image of the world she had once known? She didn't have answers, not yet, but she was determined to find them. As she moved through the broken streets, she began to notice something strange. The houses, which had once felt lifeless and hollow, now seemed to watch her. Their windows were dark, but there was something unsettling about them, an awareness that made her skin crawl. It was as though the reflection was hiding inside, lurking just behind the glass, waiting for her to make a mistake. Mara quickened her pace, the unease creeping up her spine. She was no longer alone, she realized. The reflection had made its presence known again, this time in a more subtle, insidious way. It was in the air, in the shadows that flickered at the edges of her vision. It was in the way the wind whispered her name, faintly but insistently. Mara, the voice echoed, soft and familiar, yet twisted. Come closer, you're almost there. The voice felt like a thread wrapped around her mind, tugging at her, drawing her towards something or someone. Mara shook her head, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more persistent. Don't listen to it, she whispered to herself, her hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve. It's not real. But the more she resisted, the stronger the pull became. The world around her seemed to shift, and the shadows lengthened, stretching toward her like reaching fingers. The houses, the trees, everything seemed to move, to bend in unnatural ways. And all the while, the voice continued to call her. Mara, you cannot escape me. She didn't want to listen. She couldn't afford to listen. But the voice, so haunting and familiar, made it hard to think straight. It made her question everything. What was real anymore? Was anything in this world real? Was she even real? Suddenly, a cold chill swept through the street, sending a shiver down her spine. The air thickened, and the shadows closed in tighter, pressing against her. She turned, expecting to see one of the houses looming over her, but instead, she found herself face to face with something far worse. It was her, or rather, it looked like her. The figure was standing in the center of the street, its back to her. It was tall, thin, almost emaciated, with its hair cascading down its back in a tangled mess. It wore the same clothes Mara had been wearing earlier, but there was something distinctly wrong about it. The figure's posture was stiff, unnatural, and the air around it seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. It was as if it was made of the very shadows that surrounded them. Mara's heart skipped a beat. She had seen this before, the reflection in the mirror, the one that had never quite been her. This was the creature that had haunted her, the one that had tried to replace her. And now it was standing before her, in the flesh. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. Its face was a warped version of Mara's own, twisted with malice, its eyes dark and hollow, devoid of the warmth and life that should have been there. A twisted smile spread across its face, sharp and mocking, as though it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I knew you'd come," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of Mara's own. "You can't run from yourself, Mara. You will always return to me." Mara stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the thing that looked like her. It wasn't her, it couldn't be, but the resemblance was too uncanny, too exact. The reflection had become something else, something far darker and more powerful than she had imagined. "You're not me," Mara said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You never were." The reflection tilted its head, as if considering her words. The smile on its face widened, becoming even more grotesque. "Oh, but I am you, Mara. I am everything you have tried to forget, everything you have tried to leave behind. You cannot escape me, no matter how hard you try. We are one. We always have been." Mara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let it control her. Not again. She had to stay strong. But the reflection's words echoed in her mind, reverberating like a drumbeat. What if it was right? What if she was destined to become this thing? What if there was no escape? "You are nothing but a shadow," Mara spat, her voice rising with newfound strength. "I will not let you take me again." The reflection's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing with rage. It stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. "You cannot fight me, Mara. You're already mine. It is only a matter of time before you accept it." And as the reflection closed the distance between them, Mara felt the familiar pull once again. The world around her began to warp and bend, the ground beneath her feet trembling. She could feel the reflection's presence pushing in on her, threatening to swallow her whole. But Mara refused to let go. She was not this creature. She was not its prisoner. With a cry of defiance, she took a step back, gathering all the strength she had left. The world shattered around her, splitting apart like glass. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara believed that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the reflection. The world cracked around Mara like a mirror struck by a hammer, the pieces falling away into the void. She could hear the reflection's laughter, a mocking sound that echoed in the shifting dark. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, and for a moment she was weightless, suspended in the air, surrounded by shards of glass and broken fragments of reality. But even in that weightless space, Mara didn't feel helpless. Her mind was clear, and her body, though battered by exhaustion, was determined. She had felt the reflection's grip weakening before, and now, in the face of this disorienting collapse, she fought to hold on to that fragment of control. "It cannot have me," she thought, her voice steady and firm in her mind. I will not become it. The laughter stopped, abruptly, as though the reflection had been struck dumb by her resolve. Mara's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as the broken world around her began to shift again, the jagged edges of reality sewing themselves back together. She could feel the pieces coming together, but they didn't quite match. The world reformed, warped, but it was no longer familiar. She found herself standing in a room. It was dim, the walls lined with dusty furniture, the air thick with the scent of old wood and decay. There were no windows, no doors, just a heavy silence that pressed in from every direction. The walls seemed to close in, but Mara didn't panic. She had learned something. No matter how much the reflection tried to manipulate the world around her, it couldn't take away the one thing she still had, her will. "You can't keep me here," Mara whispered, as though speaking directly to the oppressive silence. "I won't stay in your prison." Her words hung in the air, the only sound in the room. But then a low, guttural voice echoed in response, a voice she recognized, though it made her skin crawl. "You will stay, Mara," the reflection hissed, its voice serpentine. "You have nowhere else to go. This is where you belong." She turned toward the voice, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the shadows, was the reflection. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting, like a mirage that refused to solidify. But Mara could see its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that bore into her soul. The smile, once wide and mocking, was now replaced by something more sinister, something that radiated pure malice. "No," Mara said, her voice cold and defiant. "This isn't where I belong." The reflection's smile faltered, just for a second, before it spread across its face once again, even wider than before. It stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, the very air seeming to distort in its wake. "It's too late for you, Mara. You've crossed the threshold. There's no going back." The room around them seemed to tighten, the walls leaning in closer, the floor beneath Mara's feet creaking and groaning, as though it were alive, breathing in rhythm with the reflection. Panic rose in her chest, but she fought it back, pushing the fear down. She couldn't let it consume her again, not now, not when she was so close. "No," she repeated, taking a deep breath, her voice steadying. "You won't win." With every ounce of strength she had left, Mara focused on the one thing she knew to be true, that she was not the reflection. She wasn't the shadow standing before her. She was herself. She could feel it deep within, a part of her that the reflection could never touch, a part of her that had endured through everything it had thrown at her. The reflection's laughter echoed again, but this time it was tinged with desperation. "You think you can fight me? You think you can defeat me? You are nothing without me, Mara. You are nothing without this world." Mara shook her head. "I am more than this. I am more than you." The air shifted, and for a split second, Mara thought she saw a flicker of doubt in the reflection's eyes. It was only a moment, but it was enough. In that moment, the reflection was vulnerable. Mara surged forward, moving faster than she ever had before, propelled by the strength of her belief. Her hand reached out, and the world around her seemed to crack again, this time from the inside out. She could feel it, the reflection's hold on the world, loosening, slipping. "No," the reflection screamed, but it was too late. Mara's hand collided with the shifting mass of shadows, her fingers touching something solid, something real. And in that instant, the room exploded into light. The walls fell away, the floor beneath her feet shattered into nothingness, and the reflection's form disintegrated into the air, its scream echoing in the distance. Mara felt herself falling, tumbling through a void, but there was no fear in her now. Only a certainty that, no matter where she landed, she would survive. She landed hard, the impact jarring through her body. But when she opened her eyes, she found herself in a new place, no longer trapped in the reflection's world. The air was fresh, the light warm on her skin, and the world around her was silent, still. She rose to her feet, shaky but determined, her heart still racing in her chest. The reflection was gone, but she knew it wouldn't stay away forever. It would return, as it always did, but this time she was ready. She had faced it, she had fought it, and she had won. She looked around at the world she found herself in. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't home, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Mara felt like herself again. "I am not a reflection," she whispered to the empty space around her. "I am me." And with that, Mara walked forward, her steps steady, her resolve unshakable. Whatever came next, she would face it, because she knew deep down that she could never be truly lost. Mara's footsteps echoed through the unfamiliar space as she moved forward, her senses heightened, her every instinct on alert. She had escaped the reflection's grasp, for now, but the battle was far from over. The world around her was quiet, eerily so, and though the air was clear and the light warm, she could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension beneath the surface. Something was wrong. She paused, scanning her surroundings. The world she stood in now was almost ordinary, a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children played outside and neighbors greeted each other with casual smiles. There were neatly trimmed lawns, pristine sidewalks, and houses that looked as though they had been plucked from a dream. Everything appeared perfectly mundane, but Mara's skin prickled with unease. It felt too familiar. She had seen this before, the houses, the streets, even the way the trees swayed in the breeze. This was her world, the one she had known. But something was off. The light felt wrong. The stillness too perfect. As she walked further down the sidewalk, her mind raced. Was this another trick? Had the reflection found a way to pull her back in, to create a new version of her reality? She had to stay vigilant. She had to keep moving. She couldn't afford to be lulled by the seeming tranquility. She passed a house that caught her eye, an old, familiar house. It was the house from her childhood, the one where she had grown up. The sight of it made her heart stop, a pang of nostalgia mixed with a twinge of dread. How could this be? She had just escaped the reflection's world. She couldn't have been pulled back here, could she? She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The front door was open, as though inviting her inside. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her hand outstretched as though guided by some unseen force. She hesitated at the threshold, her body stiff with tension. Something wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her gut. "Mara," a voice called from inside the house. The voice was soft, familiar, and it made her heart skip a beat. She knew that voice. It was her mother's voice. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. The reflection had used her family before, tricking her with their images, mimicking their voices to manipulate her. And yet, the pull of that voice was irresistible. With a trembling hand, she stepped over the threshold. The door creaked shut behind her with a sound that echoed in the empty house. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on her. "Mara, is that you?" The voice came again, softer now, filled with warmth. "Come here, darling. I've been waiting for you." Her pulse quickened. She had to be careful. This could be another illusion, another trick from the reflection, designed to make her doubt her senses. "Mara," the voice came again, and this time it was right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The house stood empty, the hallways stretching out in both directions, shadows gathering in the corners, deep and consuming. The air grew heavier, colder. Suddenly, the reflection's laughter echoed in the house, dark and mocking. Mara froze, her body going rigid with terror. She could hear its voice, the twisted version of her own, seeping through the walls. "You always fall for it, don't you, Mara? You are mine," it hissed. The walls of the house began to close in, the ceiling lowering, the space growing smaller, more suffocating. The familiar warmth of the home turned cold, oppressive, and suffocating. The house, once a place of comfort, was now a prison, a cruel mockery of everything she had once loved. "No," Mara whispered, backing away. "I'm not yours. I'm not anyone's." The reflection's laugh grew louder, more mocking. "You never learn, do you? I've been waiting for you to return. I always win." The house seemed to shift around her, the floor beneath her feet warping as though it were alive, writhing beneath her. Mara's heart hammered in her chest, and she stumbled backward, desperate to escape. The walls were closing in, the hallway narrowing, the doors becoming smaller, more distant, until they seemed impossibly far away. She ran, her feet pounding the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls twisted as she passed, and the floor creaked beneath her. She could hear the reflection's footsteps behind her, its presence growing nearer, chasing her with relentless determination. "Mara," the voice crooned again, sickeningly sweet, like a lullaby twisted into something monstrous. "You'll never escape me." She rounded a corner and found herself in a room that shouldn't have been there, an attic of sorts, with a trapdoor at the far end. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung in every corner. The walls were covered with strange markings, symbols she didn't recognize, and at the center of the room stood an old mirror, its surface cracked and distorted, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Mara's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the mirror. She could see the faint outline of a figure standing behind her, a shadow cast against the glass. She spun around, but no one was there. The reflection was playing tricks on her, using her fear to tighten its grip. "No," she said again, this time louder with conviction. "I won't let you win." The reflection's laughter echoed one final time, a cruel, bone-chilling sound, before the air around her grew still. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the trapdoor creaked open, as though inviting her to step through. Mara hesitated, her mind racing. She knew it could be another illusion, but it was her only chance to escape. She had to take it. She approached the trapdoor cautiously, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. With a deep breath, she pulled it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. The feeling of dread that had been building inside her since she had entered the house intensified, but she stepped forward anyway, trusting that there was no other way. The trapdoor slammed shut behind her, and Mara descended into the unknown. The stairs creaked beneath Mara's feet as she descended into the darkness. Her heart pounded, each step taking her further into the unknown, away from the warmth and familiarity of the house above. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and a strange feeling of vertigo washed over her as though the very foundation beneath her was shifting, warping with each breath she took. At the bottom of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before her, bathed in an eerie, flickering light. The walls were lined with old, cracked portraits, people with blank, lifeless eyes staring out at her from their frames. They seemed to move slightly, ever so imperceptibly, as if watching her every step. The portraits were familiar faces she couldn't quite place, but the recognition was unsettling, as if the people depicted in them were ghosts of her past, figures from memories long forgotten. Mara felt a chill creep down her spine as she walked down the hallway. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew, the silence suffocating. The only sound was the soft shuffle of her footsteps against the floorboards, the creaking of the old wood under her weight. "Mara," the voice whispered from behind her, so soft it was almost inaudible. It was the reflection's voice, its tone sweet and coaxing, like a siren's call. She spun around, but no one was there. The hallway remained empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. "You can't escape me," the voice continued, this time louder, more insistent. "You're already mine." Mara's breath caught in her throat. The reflection was here, somewhere, hidden in the shadows, manipulating the world around her. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let it trap her again. Her eyes darted around the hallway, searching for any sign of an exit, any way to break free from this nightmare. At the end of the hallway, she saw a door, just one. It was old, with peeling paint and a tarnished doorknob that glinted in the dim light. The door seemed almost too normal, too out of place in the strange, oppressive atmosphere of the house. But something about it called to her, a pull that she couldn't resist. She moved toward it, her steps quickening, the door growing larger as she approached. "Mara, it's too late." The voice came again, louder this time, and the air around her seemed to distort, the walls closing in, the paintings on the walls twisting, their eyes following her every movement. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it, her heart racing. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing another room beyond, dark, filled with shadows. But as she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, cutting her off from the hallway. She whirled around, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind racing. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single flickering candle on a table in the center. The air smelled faintly of rot, and the floor was littered with dust and broken shards of glass. At first, Mara thought the room was empty. But then, she noticed something on the far wall, something that made her blood run cold. A mirror. And in that mirror, standing as still as a statue, was her reflection. But this wasn't like the reflections she had seen before. This one was different. It wasn't distorted, it wasn't mocking her. It was waiting. Her reflection stood there, staring at her, its eyes cold and lifeless, its mouth twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. "You still don't understand," the reflection whispered, its voice coming from the mirror itself. "You belong here. You always have." Mara's stomach twisted, and her pulse quickened. She took a step back, her mind racing. The reflection had never been this still before. It was as if it was patient, waiting for her to make the wrong move, waiting for her to fall into its trap. "No," she muttered under her breath, backing away from the mirror. "You won't have me." The reflection's smile widened, impossibly so, and it stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Mara stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the mirror as she tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. The reflection reached out toward the glass, its hand pressing against it with an audible thud. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting the image. "You can't escape me," the reflection hissed, its voice growing darker, more sinister. "I am you, and you are me." The words struck her like a physical blow. She felt a surge of panic rising in her chest. The reflection wasn't just a shadow. It was a part of her, a twisted, corrupted version of herself. It had always been with her, hiding beneath the surface, manipulating her thoughts, her actions. It had been feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each moment of doubt. "You will never be free," the reflection continued, its voice now a low growl. "This world, this reality, it's mine. You are mine." Mara's breath quickened, her body trembling with the weight of the words. But then, something inside her stirred, a flicker of defiance. She wasn't going to let this thing, this twisted version of herself, define her. She wasn't going to let it take over her life. She had already faced it once before and survived. She could do it again. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on her reflection. "No, I am me. I'm not you." With every ounce of strength she had left, she raised her hand and pressed it against the mirror's surface. The glass shuddered under her touch, the surface rippling like water, the reflection wavering, distorting. For a moment, Mara thought she saw something in the reflection, something that didn't belong. It was a crack in the glass, a fracture that spread like lightning across the surface. The reflection's face twisted in a grotesque mask of fury, its eyes burning with rage. But Mara didn't flinch. She kept pressing, her hand forcing its way through the glass, pushing against the barrier that separated her from her own twisted self. The reflection shrieked, its voice a terrifying, bone-chilling wail that reverberated through the room. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces, and the reflection collapsed in on itself, vanishing into the shards of broken glass. For a moment, Mara stood in the silence, her chest heaving, her hands still outstretched. The room around her seemed to settle, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the last remnants of the reflection disappeared. But as the dust settled, she knew that this wasn't over. The reflection would return, as it always did, but Mara was no longer afraid. She had broken it once, she would do it again. She turned, her resolve stronger than ever, and stepped toward the door that now stood open before her. There was no turning back. Mara stepped through the door, her heart still pounding from the intense confrontation with her reflection. The air felt different now, the oppressive weight lifting slightly as she entered the next room. It was a stark contrast to the one she had just left. This new space was cold, clinical, and empty. The walls were lined with white tiles, their surfaces gleaming as if they had been recently scrubbed. The floor was smooth, cold beneath her bare feet, and the light above her was harsh and sterile, casting sharp shadows across the room. The silence was suffocating. As her eyes scanned the room, she saw that it was long and narrow, a narrow hallway leading to another door at the far end. The walls seemed to close in on her, pushing her forward, urging her to keep moving. But something about the room felt wrong. The stillness was unsettling, and the brightness of the overhead lights made her feel exposed, as though she were under some kind of harsh examination. She took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow, her instincts screaming at her to be on guard. The sound of her footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, bouncing off the walls as if magnified. She reached the door at the far end of the room, her fingers trembling as she grasped the cold metal handle. Before she could turn it, a noise echoed from behind her, a soft click, as if something had just fallen or shifted. Mara froze. Her mind raced as she spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but the room remained as still and silent as before. Her pulse quickened. Had she imagined the sound, or had it been something else? She strained her ears, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. And then a voice broke the silence. "Mara!" It was the reflection's voice again, but this time it was softer, more soothing. The voice was laced with something like sympathy, familiar, yet foreign in its tone. "You don't have to fight anymore. You've already lost." Mara's breath caught in her throat. It was so close, as though the voice was coming from right beside her. She spun around again, but the room remained empty, the harsh lights still flickering above her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not losing. I won't lose." But the voice persisted, growing stronger, more insistent. "You always lose, Mara. You've been losing for years. You can't escape who you are. You can't escape me." Her mind reeled, trying to process the words. Losing? For years? What was it trying to say? The reflection, her own reflection, was in her mind again, twisting her thoughts, trying to make her doubt herself. "It's too late to resist," the voice purred, as if trying to soothe her. "You'll be mine forever, Mara. And there's nothing you can do about it." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't sure if the voice was a reflection of her deepest fears, or something more malevolent, something real. But whatever it was, Mara couldn't let it take control. She couldn't let it drown her in doubt and fear. Her hand gripped the doorknob tighter, and with a determined push, she wrenched it open. Beyond the door lay a room that was completely different from anything she had seen before. This room was dark, its only source of light coming from a flickering candle on a table in the center. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, stretching and twisting in strange ways, almost as if they were alive. But the most unsettling part of the room was what lay on the walls. Mirrors, dozens of them, some large, some small, all reflecting distorted images of her. Mara stepped inside, her heart racing. The mirrors were all around her, each one showing a different version of herself. In some, she was smiling, but her smile was wrong, twisted, cruel. In others, her face was filled with fear, her eyes wide and desperate. But one mirror stood out from the rest. It was larger than the others, and its surface was perfectly still, undisturbed. And in that mirror, Mara saw her reflection standing still, just as she expected. But then something happened. The reflection didn't mimic her. It smiled. It wasn't just any smile. It was a knowing, predatory smile. A smile that reached too far, too wide. And then it winked. Mara gasped, taking a step back. No, this couldn't be happening. The reflection had never been this bold, this alive. She backed away, her mind spinning. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be. Mara, you know this is the end. The voice came again, this time from all around her, echoing from the mirrors. You were never meant to escape. You belong to me. You've always belonged to me. The reflection in the mirror tilted its head, as if studying her. And then, to her horror, it stepped out of the mirror. It didn't just stay frozen on the glass. The figure in the reflection began to move, its body materializing from the silver surface, its steps slow but deliberate. It was her, or at least it looked like her, but something was off. The reflection was too perfect, too cold, too unreal. Mara backed away further, her body trembling. The reflection had never been able to move before. It had always been bound to the glass, confined to mimicking her every motion. But now it was free. It took another step toward her. No, Mara whispered, her voice cracking. No, you're not me. The reflection's lips curled into a smile, and its eyes gleamed with malevolent delight. But I am Mara. I always have been, and you can't run from yourself. It was right in front of her now, its breath cold against her skin. Mara's entire body froze, her fight-or-flight instinct kicking in, but her limbs felt paralyzed, as though they were trapped in quicksand. I am you, the reflection repeated, its voice low and threatening, and you'll never be able to leave me behind. Before Mara could respond, the reflection reached out, its hands cold as they touched her arm. The chill seeped into her skin, deeper than bone, and she gasped, her knees buckling as she tried to pull away. But the reflection's grip tightened, and with that grip, it pulled her back into the mirror. Mara's body jerked violently, and for a split second, she felt herself torn between worlds. One foot still planted firmly in the reality of the cold, dark room, the other slipping into the mirror's oppressive, shifting surface. The reflection's grip on her arm tightened, cold as ice, pulling her further into its depths. The shadows around her twisted like ink spreading through water, darkening her vision, suffocating her breath. She tried to scream, to pull away, but the reflection was too strong, its presence swallowing her whole. Her body felt weightless, as though she were floating, her movements sluggish, as if time itself had slowed down. The more she struggled, the harder it became to breathe, to move. It was as though the mirror had a life of its own, a malevolent force drawing her into its dark heart. Mara, the voice came again, soft but insistent. It was her own voice, but hollow, warped, echoing through the empty space. Her reflection inched closer, its face still contorted in that sinister smile. It wasn't just an image now, it was her. It had always been, and it knew her, knew every part of her. "I am you," it whispered, its voice blending with Mara's own, like an unbearable chorus of distorted thoughts. "You are me. There is no escape." The words reverberated in her mind, louder and louder, until they consumed her thoughts, drowning out everything else. Mara tried to focus, tried to push back against the overwhelming sensation of losing herself, but it was like fighting a tidal wave. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The reflection's grip pulled her further in, deeper, until her vision blurred completely. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The world around her shifted, and when Mara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the dark, oppressive room with the mirrors. She was standing in a vast, empty space, a place that felt both familiar and alien. The air was thick, cold, and still, but there was no sensation of weight, no sense of gravity, of earth beneath her feet. It was as though she was floating in some in-between place, a void between realities. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice small and echoing in the endless expanse. The answer came immediately, as if the void itself was responding to her question. "You are where you've always been, Mara." She spun around, but saw nothing. No walls, no doors, no mirrors. Just a deep, infinite darkness stretching out in every direction. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing, trying to process what was happening. Was she dead? Was this some kind of afterlife? No, she couldn't be. She was still here. She could feel it. But then she saw something in the distance. A flicker, a shimmer of light. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible. But then it grew brighter, more defined. A figure emerged from the light, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, and though its features were obscured, Mara could feel its presence, its weight, its power. As the figure drew closer, Mara felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew this presence. It was familiar, and yet completely foreign. It was the reflection, the twisted version of herself, the one that had trapped her. The figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly, sending a shiver down her spine. "You're finally here, Mara." She took a step back, her body tensing. No, this can't be happening. You can't be real." The figure's lips curled into a cruel smile, but the expression didn't reach its eyes. Its eyes, those eyes, were empty, hollow, the same cold, lifeless eyes that had stared back at her from every mirror. The eyes of the reflection. "I'm as real as you are," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "And you've been here all along, trapped in this world, trapped inside yourself." Mara shook her head. "No, I won't believe it. This is a dream. This isn't real. This isn't me." Her voice cracked with the weight of her disbelief. But the figure laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the empty space. "Of course it's real. Everything you've seen, everything you've experienced, that was real. And this is the truth." The figure's form seemed to grow more defined, its edges sharpening, becoming more solid, more real. As it stepped closer, the darkness around Mara seemed to shift, bending and warping. It was as though the very fabric of the void was collapsing in on itself, folding in around her, suffocating her. "You're trapped here now, Mara," the reflection continued. "This is the place where all lost things go, the place where you've always belonged. You can't run from me anymore. You are me." The words hit Mara like a punch to the gut, but there was something deeper, something that tugged at the core of her being. Was it true? Was she always destined to be here, in this place of endless darkness with no way out? Was her battle with the reflection pointless? Had it always been her? Had she always been trapped inside herself? The reflection reached out with a hand, its fingers long and cold, and as it touched Mara's arm, the void around them seemed to pulse. The darkness hummed with power. Mara gasped as a strange sensation washed over her, a feeling of deep recognition, as though she were being pulled into herself, into her own mind. And then, as though from a deep, distant place, she heard a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable, her own voice, but different. It whispered in her ear, "Fight. You can still fight." The reflection's grip on her tightened, but Mara's body suddenly surged with a jolt of energy. The voice inside her. She knew that voice. It was her, the part of herself that had been lost in the struggle, buried beneath the weight of fear and doubt. "No," she muttered, her voice gaining strength. "No, I'm not you. I'm not you." With everything she had left, Mara wrenched herself free from the reflection's grasp, her hands trembling as she reached out for the void around her, trying to push away the darkness closing in. She couldn't let it take her. She couldn't let it win. The reflection's laughter filled the space, but Mara's resolve was unbreakable. She wasn't going to lose herself. Not this time. Mara's mind spun, the tension in the air thickening as she fought with every ounce of strength left in her. The reflection herself, or the version of her that had held her captive, was still there, still laughing, but the sound seemed distant now. Faint, almost muffled. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the whisper in the depths of her mind, the one that had urged her to fight. It was a voice she recognized, a voice she had ignored for far too long. The voice that had been drowned out by fear, by uncertainty. But now it was clear, sharp, and unwavering. "Fight," it whispered again, more firmly this time. Mara opened her eyes, her hands shaking as she reached out once more. The reflection was still there, standing before her, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity, its lips curled into that cruel smile. But the longer Mara looked at it, the more she realized it wasn't her. Not truly. It was a twisted mockery, a distorted version of herself created by fear, doubt, and guilt. A manifestation of all the parts of her that she had buried. The reflection reached out again, its hand cold as it hovered in the air between them. Mara knew that if it touched her again, she would be lost. It would drag her into the darkness, into the void, and she would never escape. But Mara wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. With a primal scream, she stepped forward, shoving the reflection's hand aside, her body surging with newfound strength. The void around them shuddered as if responding to her defiance, the shadows twisting violently. The reflection staggered back, its smile faltering for a brief moment, but it quickly regained its composure, its eyes narrowing in anger. "You think you can escape me?" it hissed, its voice low and threatening. "You can't. You were never meant to be free." Mara's heart raced, her breath coming in sharp gasps, but she refused to back down. "I'm not you," she spat, her voice shaking with determination. "And I'm not going to let you control me anymore." The reflection's eyes flared with rage, its smile fading completely as it stepped forward, closing the gap between them. But Mara didn't move. She stood her ground, her body trembling but unyielding. Suddenly, the reflection's form shifted. It rippled like water, its features warping and distorting. Mara flinched, stepping back instinctively, but the reflection didn't move forward. Instead, it expanded outward, spreading across the vast expanse of the void, filling the space with its twisted, fragmented image. "You think you can defeat me?" The reflection's voice echoed from all directions, bouncing off the void, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "I am you. You can't run from yourself. You will always be mine." The entire space seemed to close in on her, the walls of darkness pressing in, suffocating her. Mara's breath caught in her throat, as she realized what was happening. The reflection wasn't just a mirror, it was the very essence of her own fear. The darkness, the endless void, it was all a manifestation of her own inner turmoil, her inability to accept the parts of herself she had hidden away. But that realization, as terrifying as it was, also gave her the strength she needed. With a deep, steadying breath, Mara closed her eyes. She could feel the reflection's presence closing in on her, its dark tendrils wrapping around her mind, threatening to swallow her whole. But Mara focused on that voice, her voice, the one that had whispered to her in the darkness. "You can fight." It was a reminder, a call to arms. She wasn't just fighting the reflection. She was fighting herself. She was fighting the darkness within her that she had ignored for so long. The guilt, the shame, the fear, all of it had taken root, had twisted her perception of herself into something she wasn't. But Mara knew who she was now. She opened her eyes, her hands shaking but resolute. The void around her rippled with power as she gathered every last ounce of strength, every scrap of defiance, and pushed it outward toward the reflection. "I am me," she said, her voice steady, even as the reflection's presence pressed in from every side. "And I will not let you consume me." A flash of light erupted from her hands, blinding and pure. The reflection screamed, its voice breaking apart, splintering into 1,000 fractured sounds. The darkness around Mara began to recede, the shadows retreating, as if they were being drawn away by an invisible force. The reflection's form flickered and distorted, its eyes burning with rage. "You can't do this," it snarled. "You're nothing without me." But Mara didn't listen. She didn't need to. She had come to understand something in that moment. The reflection, the twisted version of herself, it was only as powerful as the fear she gave it. It was a creation of her own mind, born from her doubts and insecurities. And she was no longer afraid. The light around her intensified, blinding in its brilliance, and the reflection let out a final, tortured scream as it began to disintegrate, its form breaking apart into nothingness. Mara stood in the center of the void, her heart racing, but her body steady. The darkness had receded, the weight lifted from her shoulders. The air around her was no longer oppressive. It was still, calm, quiet. For the first time, Mara could breathe freely. She looked around, her surroundings shifting as the void seemed to dissolve, replaced by the familiar sight of her own apartment. The soft light of the morning filtered through the windows, casting gentle shadows across the room. She was back in the world she had known. But she wasn't the same. Not anymore. Mara took a deep breath, her chest filling with air. The reflection was gone. The darkness had been banished. And now, for the first time in her life, she felt whole. She felt free. Mara stood in the center of her living room, still trembling but slowly regaining control over her breath. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long, delicate shadows across the walls, making the room feel warm and familiar again. But despite the comfort of the daylight, something deep inside her still gnawed at her, a lingering unease. She turned toward the mirror in the hallway, the very one that had first shown her that terrible reflection. For a moment, the reflection was all she could see. Its haunting eyes, its twisted smile, the coldness that had been a part of her for so long. But when she looked closer, the mirror was empty. Nothing stared back at her. Mara blinked, unsure whether she was seeing clearly. Had she truly escaped? Had she really banished the dark force that had controlled her? Her mind flashed back to the void, the oppressive emptiness that had surrounded her. The laughter, the voice, the endless whispers. "You are me." The words haunted her still. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, as if that would somehow help anchor her to this reality. She wasn't the reflection. She wasn't what it had wanted her to be. Still, doubt lingered uninvited. It scratched at the edges of her mind, whispering that she hadn't truly defeated it, that the reflection, her reflection, would come back, would claw its way into her life once more, pulling her back into the dark world where she didn't belong. But this time Mara knew better. The reflection could no longer hold her prisoner. It was a part of her, a distorted fragment of her psyche, shaped by her fears, but it did not define her. She turned away from the mirror and walked into the kitchen, the soft hum of the apartment's appliances filling the space. The scent of coffee drifted toward her, and she automatically reached for the kettle, beginning to fill it with water. The ritual felt grounding, comforting. The simple act of making a cup of coffee seemed to remind her that she was still here, still alive, still herself. She leaned against the counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, and for the first time since her strange ordeal had begun, a sense of calm began to settle over her. But even as she tried to embrace this newfound peace, the thought of the mirror still lingered. What would happen now? What did freedom mean if she was always looking over her shoulder, wondering whether the reflection would come back for her? Would the memories of that void always haunt her, always remind her of her fragility, her weakness? The kettle's whistle broke her from her thoughts. She poured the steaming water into her cup, the hot vapor rising into the air, filling the space with warmth. As she sat down at the small kitchen table, sipping the coffee, her gaze once again drifted toward the hallway, toward the mirror. This time, her reflection was gone. Not even a trace of it. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift from her chest. The reflection was truly gone, and yet the silence felt unnatural. She had lived with the constant hum of fear for so long that the stillness felt almost wrong. The room seemed too quiet. Her heart skipped a beat, a sudden, sharp anxiety prickling at the back of her mind. What if the reflection was still there? What if it hadn't really gone away? Mara jumped up from the table, her coffee sloshing dangerously as she rushed toward the hallway. Her breath quickened, her feet almost stumbling over each other as she approached the mirror. The air around her felt thick again, suffocating her. The hallway was empty. There was nothing. No shadow, no ominous presence. But as Mara stared at her reflection, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It was as if the mirror itself was waiting, biding its time. Her reflection looked back at her, normal, peaceful. But somehow, the longer she stared at it, the more she felt herself unraveling. The faintest flicker of something she couldn't quite place, passed over her reflection's face. Her own face, distorted just for a moment, like a wave rippling across water. Mara recoiled, her pulse racing again. It was only a brief flicker, almost imperceptible. But the sudden realization slammed into her. It wasn't over. Her reflection had been silent, waiting, watching, and now it was grinning. She spun away from the mirror, fear clawing at her chest once more, even though she knew this was her mind playing tricks on her. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. Was it? Mara gritted her teeth, determined not to succumb to fear again. She had faced the reflection, the real one, and defeated it. This was just another moment of weakness. She had to break free from this cycle. You are not me, she reminded herself again. You are not me. But then the room felt colder. The walls felt as though they were closing in again. A whisper, a familiar, mocking whisper, tickled the edges of her mind. You're not free, Mara. Her heart skipped, a cold sweat prickling on her skin. Her legs felt weak, her hands shaking. She tried to steady herself, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if the reflection was no longer confined to the mirror, no longer confined to that twisted version of herself. It had changed. The air around her hummed with a strange, suffocating energy, And then from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Just a glimpse, like a shadow passing across the floor. It was brief, too fast to fully see, but unmistakable. Her reflection, but not her. This time, its form was distorted, the outline twisting unnaturally, as if the darkness was alive, hungry. Panic surged through her chest, but Mara held her ground. She knew she had to stay strong, to break the pattern, to stop it from consuming her again. The whispering came again, filling the room. "You can't escape yourself." Mara's hands trembled as she clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This was it. She had to face it, fully and completely. There was no escaping the reflection. Not now. Her breath hitched, but Mara stood tall, her voice trembling but defiant as she said aloud, "I am not afraid." Mara's words echoed in the empty room, but instead of providing the reassurance she hoped for, they felt hollow. The reflection in the mirror hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her vision, persisted. The room felt smaller, more oppressive. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the very air around her felt thick, suffocating. For a moment, she closed her eyes, desperately trying to calm her racing heart. "Focus, Mara. Focus." She tried to center herself, to remind herself of who she was and how far she had come. The reflection, that reflection, was just a trick of her mind. It had been born from fear, from her own insecurities. But the whispering, it wasn't just in her mind anymore. It filled the room, curling around her like a serpent, coiling tighter with every passing second. "You can't escape me." The voice was softer now, as if it was coming from within her, rather than from the mirror. She swallowed hard, trembling, the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. "You're just like me." Mara's eyes snapped open. There was no mistaking it. The voice, low and sinister, was no longer just a whisper. It had taken shape, wrapped itself around the very air she breathed, and now it seemed to be coming from her own mouth. No, it wasn't her. It couldn't be. She spun toward the hallway, eyes widening as the mirror reflected her every movement. But it wasn't just her reflection anymore. There was something else in the glass now, something darker. Her own face, her true face, was still there, staring back at her. But standing beside her, almost overlapping her, was the twisted version. The version with the cruel smile, the distorted eyes, the thing that had haunted her. Mara froze in horror, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection that wasn't me, had broken free. It wasn't confined to the mirror anymore. It was walking beside her. "You can't outrun yourself, Mara," the voice said, this time coming from both the reflection and her. "There's no escape from what you truly are." Mara's hands went cold, her mind spinning in circles, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her, as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. The reflection, no, the thing beside her, grinned wider, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, mocking gleam. "It's not enough to escape me," the voice continued. "You have to accept me. You have to accept what you really are." Her body trembled, panic surging through her, but Mara pushed it aside. She wouldn't, let herself be overtaken by this thing. She had fought it once. She had faced the darkness in her soul, and she would do it again. "You are not me," Mara whispered fiercely, almost pleading. "I am not you." The reflection thing laughed, its voice cruel and distorted. "That's where you're wrong," it sneered. "I am you. I've always been you. And no matter how hard you try to fight me, no matter how much you resist, you will always be me." Mara's heart pounded in her chest. The room seemed to spin around her, the shadows lengthening, closing in like a tightening noose. She could feel herself starting to slip. This thing, was trying to pull her back into the same cycle of fear and self-loathing, to convince her that she was nothing more than the reflection, that she was no better than the twisted image that had haunted her. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to take a step forward, then another. Her feet felt heavy, as if something were dragging her back, but she pushed through. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. I am not you, she said again, louder this time. I am me. I am not a reflection. I am not a shadow. I am more than this. With each word, a surge of power washed over her, filling her with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The reflection thing flinched, its smile faltering for the briefest of moments. For the first time, it seemed uncertain, its grip on her loosening ever so slightly. You're nothing, the reflection hissed, its voice full of venom. You're weak. You're nothing without me. You can't escape yourself. Mara's resolve hardened. Her own voice, now unshakable, rang out clearly. I am not afraid anymore. The reflection recoiled, as if struck by her words. Its form flickered, rippling and distorting, as if it were losing its solidity, losing its grip on her reality. The shadows around them began to retreat, dissolving into nothingness as the light from the hallway brightened. No, the reflection gasped, its voice now tinged with desperation. You can't do this. Mara didn't give it a chance to finish. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, every fiber of her being screaming for release, for freedom. The reflection, no, the creature, dissolved into the air, its form shattering like glass, scattering into dust. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted. The cold, suffocating air was gone, replaced by the warm, steady light of the morning. Mara took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, steadying her. She was free. The reflection was gone. She had faced the darkness within herself, had broken the cycle of fear and self-doubt, and she had won. She looked around the room, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. But even as the silence stretched on, Mara knew one thing for certain. She was no longer trapped. She had learned to face her fears and to accept the parts of herself she had once denied. She had learned that the reflection, the true reflection, was not the enemy. It was a part of her, and now she was whole. Mara stood in the middle of her hallway, still breathing heavily, but the weight of the darkness had lifted. She felt lighter, somehow, freer than she had in what felt like years. Her mind, which had been consumed by fear and doubt, was now clear. She could hear the faint hum of life around her, the distant sounds of the world moving on, and for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It didn't feel like it was closing in. She looked down at her hands. They were steady now, no longer shaking. There were no signs of the fear that had once clung to her skin like a second layer. Mara exhaled slowly, her heart still racing, but the storm inside her had finally passed. Her reflection was gone. But in the silence that followed, she felt a pull, a twinge of uncertainty deep within her chest. It wasn't fear, but something else, something unfamiliar. She had faced the reflection, faced the darkness that had once controlled her every move, but now she wasn't sure what came next. Was this truly over? A shiver ran through her, and she walked to the window, peering out into the quiet world beyond. The sky was a soft blue, the clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. It looked so normal, so peaceful, and yet Mara knew that she couldn't be the same person she had been before all of this had started. She had conquered the reflection, but at what cost? Could anyone ever truly escape themselves, their inner demons? Was freedom even possible if one could never fully escape the darkness within? She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the doubts. The answers would come in time. For now, she needed to focus on the present, the here and now. The reflection, whatever it was gone. And that was all that mattered. A soft knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. She hadn't expected company. She wasn't even sure if she was ready to face the world again, but curiosity pulled her toward the door. When she opened it, a woman stood there, her expression neutral. Her hair was dark, and her eyes were sharp, calculating, as if she were appraising Mara, looking for something she couldn't quite place. "Are you Mara?" the woman asked, her voice calm and even. Mara hesitated, confused. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been looking for you." Mara felt a strange unease stir in her chest. Who is this woman? Why was she looking for her? "Who are you?" Mara asked, her voice still steady, but with a hint of suspicion. The woman paused before answering. "Someone who's been keeping an eye on things. You've been through quite a lot, haven't you?" Mara didn't speak, her mind racing. She had the sense that this was no coincidence. This woman, this stranger, knew more than she was letting on. "You're not the first," the woman continued, her tone almost pitying. "There are others like you, trapped by their own reflections. They think they've escaped, that they've won, but they're only fooling themselves." Mara's pulse quickened. The reflection wasn't truly gone. It was still here, in some form, still out there. "You think you're free," the woman said, her gaze piercing. "But the truth is, the reflection never lets go. It just waits. It watches. And it's patient." A cold wave of dread washed over Mara. The woman wasn't talking about a mere hallucination or a nightmare. She was talking about something far worse, something that could control her, even now. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Because," the woman said, stepping closer, her eyes locked onto Mara's, "you've only just begun to understand what you're really up against. The reflection doesn't just mirror you. It becomes you. And when it comes back, when it comes for you again, it will be stronger than ever." Mara felt a wave of panic rising in her chest, but she held it back, clenching her fists. "I won't let it take me again." The woman's lips twisted into a knowing smile. "We'll see about that." And just like that, the woman turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. Mara stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The door hung open, the air outside warm and still, but all she could hear was the faint echo of the woman's words in her mind. The reflection was still out there. It wasn't over. Not yet. Mara closed the door slowly, her fingers gripping the handle tightly, and for the first time, she felt a deep, gnawing fear creep through her again. Not because of what she had already faced, but because of what was still waiting for her, just out of sight. Mara stood at the door, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the woman's cryptic warning. The quiet of the room was suffocating now. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her, and though the reflection had been banished, she couldn't shake the feeling that her battle wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. The door clicked shut, the soft sound echoing through the empty hallway. Mara turned away, her pulse still pounding in her throat. She wanted to dismiss the woman's words. After all, what did she really know? How could a reflection have any real power over her life? She had faced it before, fought it, and had come out victorious. Yet the lingering unease wouldn't leave. Her footsteps were silent as she walked back into the living room, the sunlight from the windows casting soft shadows on the floor. She sat down on the couch, her hands resting on her lap as she stared out the window, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The world beyond seemed so normal, so unaware of the battle she had fought, of the terror she had faced. But in her gut, Mara knew the truth. The reflection wasn't just a shadow of her fear, a simple manifestation of insecurity. It was something darker, something that had burrowed deep within her, feeding off of her vulnerabilities, waiting for the right moment to strike. Could she ever truly escape it? The woman had made it clear that the reflection, whatever it was more than just a part of her mind. It had a life of its own, a presence that could never be entirely erased. It would always be watching, waiting for a crack in her armor. A sound interrupted her thoughts. A faint creak from the hallway. Mara's breath caught in her throat, and she slowly turned her head, her eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching long across the floor as if reaching out for her. She stood up quickly, her heart racing. Not again, she thought, her chest tight. She couldn't face it again. Not after everything she had already endured. With trembling hands, she reached for the door to the hallway, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave the apartment, to escape this place before whatever was coming could catch her. But her feet didn't move. She couldn't move. The creaking sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, whispering voice. "You can't run from me, Mara." Her body froze. The voice, it couldn't be real. But the weight of it, the presence of it, it was too powerful, too real to ignore. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Slowly, with every ounce of courage she had left, she turned toward the mirror at the end of the hallway. There it was. Her reflection stared back at her, but this time it was different. This time it was smiling, but it wasn't the smile of someone at peace, someone who had found closure. It was the grin of someone who had waited far too long, someone who had been patient. The eyes, her eyes, glowed with an unnatural intensity, no longer just a reflection of her own fear, but something more sinister, something hungry. And then it spoke, its voice a mockery of her own. "You can never escape what's inside you, Mara." Her blood ran cold. The reflection had returned, but it wasn't just a mirror image. It was something alive, something that had taken root in her very being. Mara took a step backward, her breath shallow, her body trembling. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she tried to dial, but it slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. "You will never be free," the reflection said again, its voice low and smooth, like a lullaby that promised nothing but torment. "You will always be mine." Mara's mind reeled. She had fought so hard. She had done everything in her power to escape, to break free from its grip. But the reflection had never been defeated. It had merely retreated, biding its time until she was vulnerable again. The room around her seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. The light from the windows flickered and dimmed, casting everything in a sickly, yellow glow. "You'll never be enough," the reflection whispered, its smile widening. "You'll never be whole. I am a part of you. I always have been." Mara stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The reflection was a part of her. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, it would always be there, waiting for her, lurking in the corners of her mind. She had thought she could escape it. She had thought that once she faced her fears, once she confronted the darkness within, she could leave it behind. But now, standing before her own reflection, she realized the truth. It wasn't just the mirror she had to worry about. The reflection was her, and it would never let her go. Mara's heart pounded as she stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to tear her eyes away from the reflection. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape the suffocating presence that had taken over the room. But her feet remained glued to the floor, as though the reflection was pulling her toward it, like a magnet dragging her closer with an unrelenting force. The voice, still low and smooth, echoed through her mind, its words winding through her thoughts like poison. "You think you're different, Mara. You think you're stronger than me?" Her breathing was shallow now, and she could feel the heat rising in her chest as panic threatened to consume her. This was impossible. She had faced it before, defeated it, hadn't she? But now, in front of her, this reflection, it wasn't just an image in the glass. It had substance, a dark, twisted life of its own. The room had grown colder, and the air around her seemed to pulse, thick with dread. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now felt oppressive, as if they were closing in, making her smaller, weaker. The reflection grinned wider, its face distorting, its eyes gleaming with a maddening intensity. "You will never escape me," it said, its voice layered with a cruel mockery. "I am you. I always will be. And the more you try to resist, the stronger I get." Mara's hands clenched into fists, the nails digging into her palms. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't let it be true. There had to be a way to end this, once and for all. She stumbled backward, her legs unsteady beneath her. The reflection in the mirror moved with her, mirroring her every motion, but its smile never faded, never wavered. It was as if it was enjoying her suffering. But then something changed. Mara stopped. She inhaled deeply, her mind fighting to push past the overwhelming fear. She had been here before. She had faced the reflection. She had faced herself. And it hadn't won. This isn't real. This is just a trick. Just a mirror. She focused on her breathing, her pulse slowing as she let the wave of panic pass through her, not allowing it to take hold. This time, she wouldn't run. She wouldn't let it control her. "You can't fight me," the reflection sneered, its voice dark and taunting. "You'll never be able to defeat what's inside you." But Mara's voice was steady when she spoke. "I don't need to defeat you." The reflection faltered, just for a moment. There was a flicker in its eyes, a hesitation that Mara noticed, and she seized on it. "You don't control me," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You don't define me. You're not a part of me anymore. You're just a shadow. A lie." The reflection's smile twisted into a snarl, its eyes flashing with anger. "You lie to yourself, Mara. You always have." The words stung, but Mara didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the mirror, her face mere inches from the glass, her eyes locked onto the reflection that was no longer just an image of her. It was something darker, more terrifying, something that had festered in the shadows of her mind. "I am more than you," Mara said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "I am not a mirror. I am not my fear. I am not my doubt. I am me." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The reflection stood still, its twisted grin faltering, its eyes wide and confused. It seemed uncertain, and then it screamed. The sound was deafening, a shrill, high-pitched wail that rattled the walls and sent a chill down her spine. Mara stumbled back, covering her ears, but she didn't look away. The reflection in the mirror began to distort violently, its image warping and flickering as if the glass itself was cracking under the pressure. "You can't do this," the reflection howled, its voice breaking into a jagged, fractured echo. "You can't escape me." But Mara didn't falter. She stepped forward again, this time with purpose, and as she did, she saw the reflection start to unravel, the image of her, know it, shattering like glass. "I'm not afraid of you," Mara whispered, her voice steady now, firm. "You're nothing. You have no power over me." The reflection, no the thing, screamed once more, a primal guttural sound, but it was no longer in control. The glass cracked open like a web of shattered ice, the pieces falling away, dissolving into nothing. And with that final, desperate scream, the reflection was gone. The room was silent. The mirror, once a gateway to the darkest parts of her soul, was nothing more than a broken shard on the floor. Mara stood there, breathing heavily, her legs trembling beneath her. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long had finally lifted, leaving her feeling empty, yet somehow free. For the first time in so long, she felt like she could breathe again. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in the aftermath of everything that had happened. But as the light from the window spilled across the room, warm and golden, she realized something. She wasn't just a reflection anymore. She was herself. And that's the end of the story. Make sure to like and subscribe.